In the unforgiving Wyoming Territory, some secrets are worth killing for. One man is about to discover them all. Duckfoot Ranch, a wild western action-adventure. Chapter 1. The late afternoon sun blazed across the Wyoming Territory like molten copper poured from a smelter's crucible. Heat waves shimmered above the endless expanse of sage and buffalo grass, creating phantom lakes that vanished when a man tried to focus his eyes upon them. Rip Campbell squinted through the dancing air, his weathered face creased into familiar lines of concentration as he studied the buildings of the Duckfoot Ranch sprawling before him in the distance. Something was wrong. Dead wrong. Rip shifted in his saddle, the leather creaking a protest that echoed across the stillness. His big claybank gelding, Sandy, snorted and pawed at the hardpan earth, eager to reach the water troughs that should be waiting ahead. The horse had carried Rip across 200 miles of territory in the past month, and both man and beast knew the rhythm of ranch life, as well as they knew the patterns of sunrise and sunset. But the Duckfoot lay silent as a cemetery at midnight. "Easy, boy," Rip murmured, running a calloused hand along Sandy's neck. The horse's coat was dark with sweat, and Rip could feel the animal's flanks heaving between his legs. Something ain't setting right about this whole picture. He pulled his battered Stetson lower over his eyes and studied the ranch buildings with the practiced gaze of a man who had visited more spreads than he could count. The Duckfoot had always been a model of frontier prosperity. Gary Grayson ran a tight operation, and his wife Sue kept the place neat as a pin. Even from half a mile away, a visitor could usually see signs of activity. Smoke curling from the kitchen chimney, hands working the corrals, the steady flash of sunlight on the spinning blades of the windmill that provided water for the stock. The windmill blades hung motionless against the azure sky. Rip felt a cold finger of unease trace its way down his spine despite the oppressive heat. That windmill represented one of his finest sales, made just 18 months ago when the Graysons were expanding their herd. He had spent the better part of a week installing the mechanism, adjusting the gears, and ensuring that every bolt and bearing was positioned to catch even the lightest prairie breeze. "That wheel should be spinning like a dervish in this wind," he said aloud, his voice carrying an edge of professional concern. The constant prairie wind was tugging at his hat and stirring the sage around Sandy's hooves, but the windmill's metal blades remained frozen in place like the spokes of a broken wagon wheel. Below the silent tower, a herd of white-faced cattle had gathered around the long wooden water trough. Even at this distance, Rip could hear their plaintive lowing carried on the wind. The sound spoke of genuine distress, the kind of bawling that came from animals that had been without water for hours, maybe days. "Them cows are hurting for water, something fierce," Rip muttered, his unease deepening into genuine alarm. Gary Grayson was the kind of rancher who would crawl out of his deathbed to ensure his stock had water. The man treated his cattle like they were his own children, and Sue was just as dedicated to the operation. Rip had ridden out from the territorial capital of Nutgrass with high hopes and a well-rehearsed sales pitch. The Graysons' herd had grown substantially since his last visit, and the winter had been drier than usual. All the signs pointed to a profitable sale of a second windmill to supplement their water supply. He had even picked out the perfect location during his previous visit, a slight rise on the eastern edge of their range where the wind patterns were ideal. But if the first windmill was already broken down, his chances of making a sale had just evaporated like morning dew on sun-baked rocks. Sandy shifted restlessly beneath him, and Rip realized he had been sitting motionless for several minutes, lost in thought. The horse's ears were pricked forward, focused on the ranch buildings, and Rip could see the animal's nostrils flaring as it tested the wind. Horses had senses that men lacked, and Sandy seemed as disturbed by the unnatural quiet as his rider. "Reckon we best ride on down and see what's what," Rip decided, though every instinct he possessed was telling him to turn around and head back to town. He had learned to trust those instincts during his years of traveling the frontier, selling windmills to ranchers who lived on the edge of civilization. A man who ignored his gut feelings in this country often ended up feeding the buzzards. But concern for the Graysons overrode his caution. Gary and Sue were good people, the kind of solid frontier folk who made the territory worth settling. They had treated him like family during his previous visits, and Sue's cooking was legendary throughout the region. If they were in trouble, Rip Campbell was not the kind of man to ride away without offering help. He touched his spurs lightly to Sandy's flanks, and the horse started forward at a steady walk. The approach to the Duckfoot followed a well-worn trail that wound between scattered boulders and clumps of sage. Rip had traveled this route before, but today it seemed longer, as if the very landscape was reluctant to deliver him to whatever waited ahead. The buildings grew larger as they approached, their whitewashed walls gleaming in the afternoon sun like bleached bones. The main house was a solid structure of logs and planks, built to withstand the fierce Wyoming winters. The barn stood nearby, its doors hanging open in the heat. Corrals and outbuildings spread around the central structures in the organized pattern of a working ranch. But there was no movement anywhere. No horses in the corrals. No smoke from the chimney. No sign that human beings had been near the place for days. The cattle around the water trough had noticed their approach, and several of the animals were lowing more urgently, as if pleading for relief from their thirst. The sound tugged at Rip's heart, but he forced himself to proceed carefully. Something had driven the Graysons away from their ranch, and until he knew what it was, caution seemed the better part of valor. Sandy's hoofbeats sounded unnaturally loud in the stillness as they drew closer to the buildings. Rip found himself checking the position of the Colt pistol holstered at his hip, a gesture that had become automatic during his years of frontier travel. The weight of the weapon provided a measure of comfort, though he hoped he would not need to use it. The windmill loomed ahead of them now, its steel framework reaching toward the cloudless sky like the skeleton of some prehistoric beast. The blades, that should have been spinning steadily in the prairie wind, hung as motionless as if they had been carved from stone. And still no sign of life stirred anywhere on the Duckfoot Ranch. Chapter 2. Rip guided Sandy through the milling cattle toward the ranch house, his senses alert for any sign of movement. The white-faced steers pressed close around his horse, their desperate eyes reflecting a thirst that cut deep into his conscience. These animals had been without water for at least 2 days, judging by their condition, and their distress filled the air with an urgent chorus of bellowing. "Take it easy, boys," he murmured to the cattle, though his words carried little comfort. Without water, these beasts would be dead within another day or two, their carcasses scattered across the range like grim monuments to neglect. Sandy picked his way carefully through the herd, his iron shoes ringing against the occasional stone embedded in the hard-packed earth around the water trough. Rip leaned forward in his saddle and peered into the wooden container that should have been brimming with cool well water. Instead, he found only cracked mud and a few dried leaves blown in by the relentless wind. The sight confirmed his worst fears about the windmill's condition, but it raised even more troubling questions about the Graysons' absence. Gary would never abandon his stock to die of thirst, not even if every demon in hell was chasing him across the territory. Rip straightened in his saddle and swept his gaze across the ranch buildings, searching for any clue that might explain the mystery. The barn doors stood wide open, revealing shadowy depths that should have contained horses, harnesses, and 1,000 tools of ranch life. The corrals that normally held the working stock stood empty, their gates hanging loose on leather hinges. A movement at the back door of the house caught his attention, and Rip felt his muscles tense like coiled springs. A figure emerged from the kitchen doorway, but it was not the familiar form of Gary Grayson or his copper-haired wife. The man who stepped into the afternoon sunlight was built like a bull, with massive shoulders that strained against his faded shirt and arms that hung nearly to his knees. His head seemed too small for his powerful body, but what it lacked in size it made up for in sheer menace. Black hair grew low on his forehead, nearly meeting the heavy brows that shadowed eyes the color of winter ice. A gun belt rode low on the stranger's hips, the holster positioned for a fast draw. The weapon's handle showed the wear patterns of constant use, and Rip noticed that the man's right hand never strayed far from the grip. "You there," the stranger called out, his voice carrying the harsh rasp of a man who had spent too many years breathing alkali dust and tobacco smoke. "What's your business here?" Rip touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of polite greeting, though every instinct warned him that courtesy would be wasted on this hard case. "Name's Campbell," he replied, keeping his voice steady and conversational. "I'm looking for Gary Grayson. Got some business to discuss with him." The stranger moved away from the doorway with a rolling gait that reminded Rip of a grizzly bear he had once encountered in the Montana mountains. There was the same sense of barely contained violence, the same promise of explosive action if the wrong word was spoken or the wrong move was made. "Grayson ain't here no more," the man said, stopping about 20 feet from where Rip sat his horse. "Him and his woman pulled out 3 days back. Sold the place and everything on it." The words hit Rip like a physical blow. Gary Grayson selling the Duckfoot made about as much sense as a fish deciding to climb a tree. The young rancher had put his heart and soul into building this spread, had talked for hours about his plans for expansion and improvement. Sue had been equally devoted to making the ranch into a real home, with flower beds and vegetable gardens that were the envy of every other ranch wife in the territory. "Sold out," Rip repeated, unable to keep the disbelief from his voice. "That don't sound like Gary Grayson. This place was his life." The stranger's ice-cold eyes narrowed, and his hand dropped closer to his gun butt. "You calling me a liar, mister?" "Not calling you anything," Rip replied carefully, recognizing the danger signals that preceded frontier violence. "Just saying, it's hard to believe. Gary never mentioned any plans to sell when I saw him last spring." "Plans change," the stranger said with a shrug that set his massive shoulders rippling. "Man gets tired of fighting the elements, fighting the Indians, fighting to make $1 out of 15 cents. Smart ones know when to cut their losses and move on." Rip studied the man's face, searching for any sign of deception. The features were as readable as granite, giving away nothing of the thoughts behind those pale eyes. But something in the stranger's manner suggested he was not telling the complete truth, if indeed he was telling any truth at all. "Mind if I ask who you might be?" Rip ventured, keeping his tone neutral. "And who you bought the place from?" The stranger's laugh held no humor, only a harsh bark that might have come from a wolf's throat. "Name's Lello," he said after a moment's hesitation. "Bought the spread through a lawyer fellow down in Cheyenne. All legal and proper, with papers filed and everything." Lello. The name meant nothing to Rip, but he filed it away for future reference. If this man truly owned the Duckfoot now, there were dozens of questions that needed answers. Why had the Graysons left so suddenly? Where had they gone? And why in blazes wasn't this Lello fellow taking care of the stock that came with the property? "Well, Mr. Lello," Rip said, gesturing toward the cattle gathered around the empty trough, "I reckon you might want to get that windmill working. These beeves are mighty thirsty, and dead cattle don't bring much at market." Ludlow's expression darkened like a thundercloud, and his hand moved another inch closer to his weapon. "I don't recall asking for your advice, stranger. We'll take care of our own affairs without any help from passing saddle tramps." The insult was calculated to provoke a reaction, and Rip felt his temper begin to rise. But he had learned long ago that anger was a luxury a man could not afford when facing a gunfighter. Instead, he forced a smile and touched his hat brim again. "No offense intended," he said mildly. "Just hate to see good stock suffer for want of water. I'm in the windmill business myself, and I sold Gary that wheel up there. Guaranteed to work in any wind stronger than a baby's breath, and there's enough breeze today to power half a dozen mills." "Maybe the damn thing's broke," Ludlow suggested, though his tone indicated he had no real interest in the subject. "Could be," Rip agreed. "Mind if I take a look?" "Won't charge nothing for the examination, and if it's something simple, I might could fix it right quick." Ludlow's pale eyes studied Rip with the intensity of a hawk watching a mouse. "You some kind of good Samaritan, Campbell? Or maybe you figure to charge me plenty for whatever fixing needs doing?" "Just a businessman trying to protect his reputation," Rip replied. "I guaranteed that windmill, and I stand behind my work. If it's failed through some fault of mine, I'll make it right at no cost to you." For a long moment, the two men faced each other in silence, the tension stretching between them like a taut rope. The cattle continued their plaintive bawling, and the wind whispered through the sage with a sound like distant voices carrying secrets across the endless prairie. Finally, Ludlow stepped back toward the house, his hand never leaving the vicinity of his gun. "You stay away from that windmill and everything else on this property," he said, his voice carrying the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. "We don't want no strangers poking around our business. You'd best move along before you wear out what little welcome you never had." The dismissal was as clear as a slap across the face, but Rip recognized that pushing the matter further would likely result in gunplay. Whatever was happening at the Duckfoot Ranch, this Ludlow character was determined to keep it hidden from prying eyes. "Suit yourself," Rip said, gathering his reins. "But those beeves won't last much longer without water." He turned Sandy away from the house, but his mind was already working on the puzzle that surrounded the Duckfoot's new ownership. Something stank about this whole situation, and it wasn't just the smell of dying cattle. Chapter 3. The sun had begun its descent toward the western mountains by the time Rip Campbell guided Sandy away from the Duckfoot Ranch, his mind churning with unanswered questions and growing suspicions. The encounter with Ludlow had left a bitter taste in his mouth, like alkali water from a poisoned well. Everything about the man's story rang false as a $3 coin, from his claim of legal ownership to his complete indifference toward the dying cattle. Rip had dealt with enough frontier characters to recognize the type. Ludlow was no rancher, legal or otherwise. The calluses on his hands were in the wrong places, formed by gripping gun handles rather than rope and branding irons. His boots showed no signs of barn muck or corral dust, and his pale eyes held the cold calculation of a predator rather than the steady patience of a man who worked with livestock. Most telling of all was his casual dismissal of the cattle's suffering. Even the hardest cases Rip had encountered possessed some vestige of practical concern for valuable property. Those white-faced steers represented thousands of dollars on the hoof, and no legitimate owner would allow them to die of thirst while a perfectly good windmill stood broken and unrepaired. Sandy picked his way carefully along the rocky trail that led away from the ranch, his iron shoes striking sparks from the scattered stones. The horse seemed as eager as his rider to put distance between themselves and the mysterious new occupants of the Duckfoot. Animals possessed instincts that men often ignored at their peril, and Sandy had been skittish and nervous throughout their entire visit. As they crested a low ridge that provided a last view of the ranch buildings, Rip reined in his mount and turned for one final look. The windmill's motionless blades stood silhouetted against the blazing sky like the arms of a scarecrow, and the distant sound of lowing cattle carried on the evening breeze. Somewhere in those buildings, he was certain, lay the answers to questions that were beginning to multiply like prairie dogs in springtime. But darkness was approaching, and the nearest town lay 20 miles to the south. The prudent course would be to make camp in some sheltered spot and return to investigate further when he had more information and possibly some backup. Ludlow struck him as the type who might shoot first and ask questions later if he caught someone prowling around his property after nightfall. Rip touched his spurs to Sandy's flanks and started down the far side of the ridge, following a game trail that wound between towering sandstone formations. The landscape here was broken and wild, carved by countless years of wind and water, into a maze of canyons and draws that could hide an army of men. It was beautiful country in its own harsh way, but it was also dangerous for the unwary traveler. The main road to town followed a circuitous route around the worst of the Badlands, adding several miles to the journey, but avoiding the treacherous footing and potential ambush sites that lurked in the canyon country. Most sensible folks stuck to the established routes, especially when traveling alone. But Rip had explored these canyons during previous visits to the territory, and he knew of a shortcut that could save him 2 hours of hard riding. The trail was narrow and challenging, requiring careful navigation through a series of steep-walled draws, but it was passable for a sure-footed horse and an experienced rider. More importantly, it would give him time to think without the distraction of meeting other travelers on the main road. The puzzle of the Duckfoot Ranch demanded careful consideration, and solitude was often the best companion for a man wrestling with complex problems. The entrance to Devil's Canyon opened before them like a wound in the earth, its red sandstone walls rising nearly 100 feet on either side. The narrow passage twisted and turned like a snake's back, following the path carved by flash floods over countless generations. In some places, the walls pressed so close together that a man could touch both sides with outstretched arms. Sandy's hooves echoed eerily in the confined space, the sound bouncing off the stone walls and creating phantom riders that seemed to follow just out of sight. The air was cooler here, shaded from the sun's direct rays, but it carried an oppressive weight that made breathing feel labored and difficult. Rip had traveled this route 3 times before without incident, but today something felt different. The usual desert sounds were muted, as if the canyon walls were absorbing more than just sunlight. Even the ever-present wind seemed subdued, creating an unnatural stillness that set his nerves on edge. Sandy sensed it too. The big gelding's ears were constantly moving, swiveling to catch sounds that might not even exist. His nostrils flared repeatedly, testing air currents for scents that didn't belong in this desolate place. More than once, the horse tried to turn back toward the canyon mouth, only to be urged forward by his rider's steady hand. "Easy, boy," Rip murmured, though his own unease was growing with each step. "Just a case of jumpy nerves. We'll be through this scratch in another half hour, and then it's clear sailing to town." The canyon floor was littered with boulders that had fallen from the walls over the years, forcing them to pick their way carefully between obstacles that could easily lame a horse or trap an unwary rider. Some of the rocks were large as houses, creating shadowy alcoves and hidden recesses where anything might be lurking unseen. It was from one of these shadowy hiding places that death came calling. The rifle shot cracked like thunder in the confined space, the sound amplified by the stone walls until it seemed as though the very earth was splitting apart. The bullet whined past Rip's ear with the angry buzz of a hornet, close enough that he could feel the heat of its passage. Sandy reared in terror, his iron shoes striking sparks from the rocky ground as he fought to maintain his balance. Rip fought to stay in the saddle, while his right hand instinctively dropped toward his holstered Colt. Training and experience took over, overriding the natural human tendency to freeze when faced with sudden violence. A second shot rang out before he could locate the shooter, this one closer than the first. The bullet struck a boulder near Sandy's head, sending chips of stone flying like shrapnel. The horse screamed in fear and pain as one of the sharp fragments opened a cut along his neck. "Arriba las manos, gringo." The voice echoed from somewhere ahead, speaking Spanish with the harsh accent of the borderlands. "Raise your hands, or the next bullet finds your heart." Rip's eyes swept the canyon walls and the maze of fallen rocks, searching for the source of the deadly voice. Movement caught his attention near a cluster of boulders about 50 yards ahead, where a rifle barrel protruded from between 2 massive stones like the snout of some mechanical serpent. The position was well chosen, commanding a clear field of fire down the length of the canyon while providing excellent cover for the shooter. Anyone trying to retreat would present an easy target, while advancing would mean riding directly into the rifle's deadly embrace. "What do you want?" Rip called out, fighting to keep his voice steady while his mind raced through possible courses of action. None of them looked particularly promising. "Your money, your horse, your weapons," came the reply. "Everything you carry, you leave here. Maybe then you walk away with your life, see?" The accent was thick, but the English was clear enough. This was no random bandit seeking easy prey. The ambush had been carefully planned and executed, suggesting that someone had been watching his movements and had anticipated his use of this shortcut. "I don't carry much money," Rip replied, playing for time while he studied the tactical situation. "Just a traveling salesman trying to make an honest dollar." Harsh laughter echoed from the rocks. "Mentiroso. Liar. We know who you are, Senor Campbell. We know why you came to the ranch. And we know you must not leave here to tell others what you have seen." The words hit Rip like a physical blow. This was no random highway robbery. Someone at the Duckfoot Ranch had anticipated his investigation and had sent this gunman to ensure his permanent silence. The implications were staggering and terrifying. Whatever secrets the ranch held, they were worth killing for. Sandy was trembling beneath him, the horse's fear adding another dangerous variable to an already desperate situation. In this narrow canyon, there was nowhere to run and precious little cover to hide behind. The ambusher held every advantage except one. Rip Campbell had not survived years of frontier travel by surrendering meekly to overwhelming odds. His hand closed around the grip of his Colt pistol, and he began to calculate angles and distances with the cold precision of a man whose life depended on mathematical accuracy. Chapter 4. The acrid smell of gunpowder hung in the canyon air like incense in a church of violence. Rip Campbell crouched behind a weathered boulder, his Colt pistol still warm in his hand, while the echoes of the final gunshot faded into the stone walls around him. 30 feet away, the Mexican gunman lay sprawled among the rocks where he had fallen, his rifle knocked from nerveless fingers by Rip's last bullet. The shootout had lasted less than 2 minutes, but it had felt like hours. The ambusher had possessed skill and cunning, using the canyon's acoustics to mask his position while raining lead down from his rocky fortress. But desperation and superior marksmanship had eventually turned the tide, allowing Rip to work his way close enough for a killing shot. Sandy stood nearby, his flanks still heaving from terror and exertion. The cut on his neck had stopped bleeding, leaving only a thin line of dried blood to mark how close they had both come to death. The horse's eyes remained wide and wild, constantly scanning the canyon walls for fresh dangers that might emerge from the shadows. Rip approached the dead man cautiously, his weapon still drawn and ready. Frontier experience had taught him that apparently dead enemies sometimes possessed an annoying tendency to spring back to life at the worst possible moments. But this one was genuinely finished, his sightless eyes staring up at the strip of sky visible between the canyon walls. The gunman was younger than his voice had suggested, probably no more than 25, with the lean build and weathered features of a man who had lived hard and fast. His clothes were well-made but travel-stained, and his boots showed the distinctive wear patterns of a rider who spent more time in the saddle than on foot. Most tellingly, his gun belt and holster were of fine leather, oiled and cared for with the devotion that professionals showed their tools. This was no common bandit or cattle rustler. The dead man was a hired gun, someone brought in specifically for his skills with weapons and his willingness to use them for pay. The revelation deepened the mystery surrounding the Duckfoot Ranch and raised new questions about the scope of whatever conspiracy was unfolding there. Rip searched the body methodically, looking for anything that might provide clues about his employer or the reasons for the ambush. The man's pockets yielded little of interest: a few silver coins, a plug of tobacco, and a folded piece of paper that proved to contain nothing more significant than a grocery list written in Spanish. But tucked inside the man's vest was something far more valuable than money or personal effects. A letter, sealed with red wax and bearing the imprint of a signet ring, had been carefully protected from the elements by an oilskin wrapper. The address was written in an educated hand, directing the correspondence to one Miguel Santos, in care of general delivery at the territorial capital. Rip broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet of expensive paper. The message was brief and written in the same careful script as the address. The windmill man must not reach town. Handle the matter permanently and await further instructions. Payment as agreed upon completion. It was signed with a single initial, K. The letter confirmed Rip's worst suspicions. Someone with enough resources to hire professional killers was determined to keep the secrets of the Duckfoot Ranch hidden from outside scrutiny. The fact that they had anticipated his investigation and prepared an ambush suggested a level of organization and planning that went far beyond simple criminal activity. But who was Kay, and what secrets were worth killing to protect? The sun was sinking rapidly toward the western horizon, painting the canyon walls in shades of red and gold that reminded Rip uncomfortably of blood and fire. Soon darkness would claim the twisting passages of Devil's Canyon, making travel treacherous for man and horse alike. The sensible course would be to make camp and wait for morning before attempting to navigate the remaining miles to town. Instead, Rip found himself considering a far more dangerous alternative. The letter had revealed that his enemies expected him to head for town, probably to report his suspicions to the territorial authorities. They would be watching the roads and trails, ready to finish what Miguel Santos had started. But they would not expect him to return to the Duckfoot Ranch. The idea was madness, of course. Whatever was happening at the ranch, it was clearly defended by men who would not hesitate to kill anyone who threatened their operations. Riding back into that hornet's nest alone would be tantamount to suicide. On the other hand, it might be his only chance to discover the truth. By now, his failure to appear in town would alert his enemies that their ambush had failed. They would expect him to flee the territory or seek help from the law. The last thing they would anticipate was a direct assault on their stronghold by a lone windmill salesman. The element of surprise was often worth more than superior numbers, and Rip had learned to value information above personal safety. Whatever was happening at the Duckfoot, it involved people he cared about and threatened innocent lives. Gary and Sue Grayson deserved better than to be written off as another frontier mystery. Sandy had calmed considerably during the search of the dead gunman's belongings, but the horse still showed signs of nervousness when Rip approached with the reins. The animal had been through enough trauma for one day, and asking him to carry his rider back into danger seemed like a poor reward for faithful service. "Sorry, old boy," Rip murmured as he swung into the saddle. "I know you've had a rough day, but we've got more work to do before we can rest." The return journey through Devil's Canyon proceeded without incident, though both horse and rider remained alert for signs of additional ambushers. The mysterious K might have other employees in the area, and the failure of the first attempt would undoubtedly prompt increased security measures. By the time they emerged from the canyon's mouth, full darkness had settled over the landscape like a heavy blanket. The moon was only a thin crescent, providing barely enough light to distinguish rocks from shadows. Normal travel would have been impossible, but Rip had learned to trust Sandy's night vision and sure-footedness during their years together. The approach to the Duckfoot Ranch required careful planning. The open ground around the buildings would make concealment difficult, and any attempt to ride directly up to the house would likely result in another gunfight with odds heavily stacked against him. Instead, Rip guided Sandy in a wide circle that would bring them to the ranch from the north, where a line of cottonwood trees along a dry creek bed offered some cover. The ranch buildings appeared as dark silhouettes against the star-filled sky, with only a single light glowing in one of the house windows. The windmill stood like a sentinel over the scene, its motionless blades barely visible in the dim light. The cattle had dispersed somewhat from their earlier gathering around the empty water trough, but their occasional lowing still carried across the night air. Rip dismounted near the creek bed and secured Sandy's reins to a sturdy cottonwood branch. The horse would remain hidden among the trees, ready for a quick escape if circumstances required a hasty retreat. The arrangement was far from ideal, but it represented the best compromise between stealth and tactical flexibility. Moving on foot, Rip began his careful approach to the ranch buildings. The ground was littered with small stones and dried vegetation that could betray his presence if he stepped carelessly. Each movement required patience and concentration, skills he had developed during his years of frontier travel. As he drew closer to the barn, details began to emerge from the darkness that had been invisible during his daylight visit. The building's large doors, which had stood open during his encounter with Lello, were now closed and secured with a heavy chain and padlock. Fresh wheel ruts in the dirt suggested that wagons had been moved in and out recently, despite the supposed abandonment of the property. Most intriguing of all, the barn's interior showed signs of recent activity. Thin lines of light leaked through gaps in the weathered boards, indicating that someone was working inside despite the late hour. The discovery sent a chill down Rip's spine as he realized that the Duckfoot Ranch was far from abandoned. Whatever secrets it held were being actively protected by people who would kill to keep them hidden. Chapter 5. The barn loomed before Rip like a weathered monument to frontier industry, its dark bulk blotting out a section of the star-filled sky. The thin streams of light, seeping through gaps in the planking, created a patchwork of golden lines across the structure's face, evidence of activity within that contradicted everything Lello had claimed about the ranch's abandonment. Rip pressed himself against the building's north wall, feeling the rough texture of sun-warped boards against his back while he listened for sounds that might reveal the nature of the work being conducted inside. The barn's interior echoed with the unmistakable sounds of men at labor, the scrape of shovels against dirt, the thud of heavy objects being moved, and the occasional muffled curse when someone's efforts met with frustration. At least 3 distinct voices could be heard through the walls, speaking in tones too low for their words to be understood clearly. The conversation was conducted primarily in English, though occasional Spanish phrases punctuated the discussion. Whatever these men were doing, it required considerable physical effort and was important enough to justify working through the night. Moving with the careful stealth of a hunting cat, Rip worked his way along the barn's perimeter in search of a vantage point that would allow him to observe the interior activities. The building's original construction had been solid and professional, but years of harsh weather had opened small gaps between boards and around windows that could serve as improvised spy holes. Near the barn's eastern corner, he discovered a knothole in one of the planks that provided a narrow but adequate view of the interior. Rip pressed his eye to the opening and peered into a scene that made his blood run cold with understanding and rage. The barn's central area had been excavated to create a pit approximately 8 feet square and 6 feet deep. Lanterns positioned around the edges cast dancing shadows across the walls, while providing sufficient illumination for the 3 men who were methodically digging with shovels and picks. The excavated dirt had been carefully piled on canvas tarps, ready for disposal or concealment. But it was not the hole itself that filled Rip with fury. It was the 2 figures bound with rope and positioned against the barn's far wall, watching their captors with expressions of defiant terror. Gary and Sue Grayson sat back to back on the dirt floor, their hands tied behind them and their mouths gagged with strips of cloth. Gary's face showed the purple and yellow marks of a severe beating, while Sue's dress was torn and stained with what appeared to be dried blood. Both looked as though they had been held captive for several days, confirming Rip's suspicions about Ludlow's story of their voluntary departure. The sight of their suffering ignited a cold rage in Rip's chest that threatened to overwhelm his judgment. These were good people, honest frontier folk who had worked hard to build something worthwhile in the wilderness. They deserved better than to be terrorized by the scum who had invaded their home and turned their property into a fortress of criminal enterprise. 3 men continued their excavation work, pausing occasionally to examine objects they unearthed from the pit. Rip recognized Ludlow's massive frame immediately, his shirt soaked with sweat as he wielded a pick with methodical determination. The other 2 were strangers, but their appearance marked them as cut from the same violent cloth as their leader. One was a tall, cadaverous man with hollow cheeks and eyes that seemed to burn with perpetual fever. His movements were quick and nervous, like those of a man who had spent too many years looking over his shoulder for pursuing lawmen. A gun belt encircled his narrow waist, and he kept glancing toward the barn doors as if expecting unwelcome visitors. The third member of the group was shorter and broader, with the rolling gait of a man who had spent considerable time at sea. His arms were covered with tattoos that spoke of exotic ports and violent adventures, while his face bore the characteristic scars of numerous knife fights. Unlike his companions, he seemed completely at ease with their criminal activities, whistling tunelessly while he shoveled dirt. "How much deeper you figure we got to go?" the sailor asked, pausing to mop sweat from his scarred features. "Till we find it," Ludlow replied curtly, his voice carrying the harsh edge of frustration. "Ezra said it was buried deep, maybe 8 or 10 feet down. We keep digging till we hit something that ain't dirt." The tall man with the fever eyes looked up from his work, his gaze darting toward the bound captives. "Maybe we should ask them again," he suggested, his voice carrying an unpleasant eagerness. "I bet the woman would talk if we applied the right kind of persuasion." "We already tried that route, Kuznits," Ludlow said with evident irritation. "They claim they don't know nothing about it, and beating on them ain't changed their story none." Kuznits. The name struck Rip like a physical blow, as he recognized it from wanted posters that decorated law offices throughout the territory. The Kuznits brothers were wanted for bank robbery, murder, and a dozen other crimes that had left a trail of blood across 3 states. If Ludlow was working with that family of killers, the situation was far more dangerous than he had initially imagined. "Ezra died before he could tell us exactly where he buried the money," the sailor observed, attacking the dirt with renewed vigor. "All we know for sure is that it's somewhere on this property, probably near the barn. Which is why we're tearing this place apart board by board if necessary," Ludlow growled. $30,000 don't just disappear into thin air. $30,000. The sum was staggering, representing more money than most frontier families would see in a lifetime. No wonder the gang was willing to kill to protect their secret. With that kind of treasure at stake, human life became as cheap as yesterday's newspaper. Rip continued watching through the knothole, his mind racing as he tried to formulate a plan that could rescue the Graysons without getting all 3 of them killed in the process. The odds were heavily stacked against any lone rescue attempt, but he could not simply ride away and abandon Gary and Sue to their fate. The sound of approaching footsteps from outside the barn sent a chill of alarm through his system. Someone was walking around the building's perimeter, and Rip realized with growing horror that his own presence had been detected. "Well, well," a familiar voice drawled from the darkness behind him. "Look what we got ourselves here, boys. Seems like our windmill salesman is more curious than what's healthy for his continued existence." Rip spun around to find himself facing the business end of a Colt .44, held in the steady hand of a 4th gang member who had somehow managed to approach undetected. The man was of medium height and build, with intelligent eyes that missed nothing, and a face that belonged in a poker game rather than on a wanted poster. "Easy now," the gunman continued in a conversational tone. Let's just slip that iron out of leather real slow and gentle like. No sudden moves, and maybe you'll live long enough to regret your curiosity." The weapon in Rip's holster might as well have been on the moon for all the good it would do him now. The distance was too great, the other man's gun already drawn and aimed, and any attempt to resist would result in immediate death. Reluctantly, Rip lifted his Colt from its holster using only his thumb and forefinger, then let it drop to the ground with a metallic thud that seemed to echo like thunder in the night silence. "Smart man," his captor observed with genuine approval. "Now let's go inside and introduce you to the rest of the family. I got a feeling the boss is going to be real interested in having a conversation with you." The barn doors swung open at his captor's whistle, spilling yellow lantern light across the ground like liquid gold. Lello appeared in the opening, his massive frame silhouetted against the interior illumination, while the pick handle in his hands promised unpleasant consequences for anyone who had interfered with their operations. "Bring him in," Lello commanded, his voice carrying the satisfied tone of a man whose suspicions had been proven correct. "Looks like our windmill friend decided to come back and see what all the fuss was about." As Rip was prodded forward at gunpoint, he caught a glimpse of Gary Grayson's face through the barn doors. The young rancher's eyes widened with recognition and something that might have been hope. But that hope was tempered by the knowledge that Rip's capture had only added another victim to the gang's collection, not brought salvation any closer. The barn's interior was even more ominous at close range, with the excavated pit yawning like an open grave in the lantern light. Whatever secrets lay buried beneath the Duckfoot Ranch, they had already claimed several lives and seemed destined to claim more before the night was over. Chapter 6. The storage dugout beneath the Duckfoot's main house had been carved from the hillside during the ranch's early days, when Indian raids were still a constant threat, and pioneers needed secure places to store their most precious possessions. Gary Grayson had mentioned it during one of Rip's previous visits, describing how the previous owner had used the underground chamber to hide supplies and ammunition during the worst of the territorial troubles. Now it served as a prison, more effective than any jail cell. Rip tumbled down the narrow wooden steps as Lello's massive boot connected with his spine, sending him sprawling across the dugout's dirt floor in an explosion of pain and breathless fury. The impact drove the air from his lungs and sent stars dancing across his vision, but he managed to roll away from the stairs before the big man could deliver another kick. "Welcome to your new accommodations," Lello rumbled from the dugout's entrance, his bulk blocking most of the lantern light that filtered down from above. "Hope you find the company agreeable, 'cause you're going to be spending considerable time getting acquainted." The heavy wooden door slammed shut with a finality that echoed through the underground chamber like the closing of a coffin lid. The scratch of a heavy bar being dropped into place on the outside confirmed that escape through the entrance would be impossible without tools and considerable time. Darkness engulfed the dugout like a living thing, so complete that Rip could not see his own hand when he held it inches from his face. The air was thick and musty, carrying the sense of earth and old timber, along with something else that made his stomach clench with apprehension. "Rip Campbell, is that you?" Gary Grayson's voice emerged from the blackness somewhere to his left, weak but unmistakably recognizable. The sound of his friend's voice sent a surge of relief through Rip's battered frame, confirming that both captives were still alive despite their ordeal. "It's me, Gary," Rip replied, his own voice hoarse from the rough treatment he had received. "Are you hurt bad? What about Sue?" "We're alive," came Sue Grayson's voice from the same direction, though it carried a tremor that spoke of physical and emotional trauma. "Banged up some, but nothing that won't heal given time and decent treatment." Rip began crawling toward the sound of their voices, using his hands to feel his way across the uneven dirt floor. The dugout was larger than he had expected, perhaps 12 feet square, with walls of fitted stone that spoke of careful construction. His groping fingers encountered various objects scattered across the floor, broken pottery, scraps of cloth, and what felt like the remains of wooden crates that had been smashed apart. "They've been using us for target practice," Gary said bitterly, as Rip located them in the far corner of the chamber. Both Graysons were bound hand and foot with rope that felt new and strong, their bonds tight enough to cut off circulation. "Trying to make us tell them something we don't know nothing about." Rip's fingers worked at the knots binding Gary's wrists, though the darkness made the task nearly impossible. The rope had been tied by someone who understood the craft of restraint, with multiple loops and complicated turns that would require considerable time to unravel, even under ideal conditions. "What are they looking for?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer from his eavesdropping outside the barn. "Money," Sue replied, her voice carrying a mixture of anger and bewilderment. "They keep asking about money that's supposed to be buried somewhere on our property. $30,000 from some bank robbery that happened before we ever set foot on this land. They claim a dying man told them it was hidden here," Gary added, wincing as Rip's efforts to free him pulled against his injured wrists. "Fellow named Ezra something. Never heard of him in my life, but they're convinced we're lying about it." Rip paused in his work on the ropes as understanding dawned. The previous owner of the Duckfoot Ranch had been a secretive man named Ezra Blackwood, who had sold the property to the Graysons for a price well below its actual value. At the time, everyone had assumed the old hermit simply wanted to move on to more isolated country. Now it appeared that Blackwood had been harboring secrets far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. "Ezra Blackwood," Rip said aloud. "The man who sold you this place. He must have been involved with this gang somehow." "That's what we figured," Gary agreed. "But knowing it don't help us none. We never found any money, never even suspected it might be here. These animals won't believe us, no matter what we say." The sound of footsteps above their heads interrupted the conversation, followed by muffled voices that filtered down through the floor planks. The gang members were discussing their next moves, though their words were too indistinct to understand clearly. Occasionally, a burst of harsh laughter would echo through the chamber, sending chills down Rip's spine, as he imagined what might be amusing men capable of such casual brutality. "How long have they had you?" Rip asked, returning his attention to the stubborn knots. 4 days now," Sue replied. "They showed up, pretending to be cattle buyers, said they'd heard we might be interested in selling part of our herd. Gary invited them in for coffee, and the next thing we knew, guns were pointed at our heads. They've been taking turns working on us," Gary added grimly. "Mostly threats and rough handling so far, but that tall one with the crazy eyes keeps suggesting they try more serious persuasion." Rip's blood chilled as he recalled Kuznic's eager expression when he had suggested applying pressure to Sue. Men like that possessed appetites that went far beyond simple greed, and their restraint would not last indefinitely if they became convinced that torture was necessary to achieve their goals. "We got to get out of here," he said with quiet urgency. "Tonight, if possible. I don't think they're going to keep asking politely much longer." His fingers had finally found the key knot in Gary's bonds, but the rope was drawn so tight that loosening it would require more force than his cramped position allowed. The dugout's confines made it nearly impossible to get proper leverage, and the complete darkness hindered every movement. "There's some old tools scattered around here," Sue whispered. "Broken shovel handles, pieces of metal, things like that. Maybe something we could use to cut the ropes." Rip began a systematic search of the dugout's floor, feeling his way inch by inch through the accumulated debris of years. His hands encountered fragments of pottery, rotted leather, and chunks of wood that crumbled at his touch. But near what felt like the remains of an old barrel, his fingers closed around something that sent hope surging through his chest. A piece of broken glass, probably from a whiskey bottle, with one edge sharp enough to serve as a crude knife. It was not much, but it might be sufficient to saw through rope if used carefully and persistently. "Found something," he whispered, returning to where the Graysons waited. "Going to take some time, but I think I can cut you loose." The work was painstakingly slow and dangerous in the absolute darkness. The glass shard was treacherous to handle, threatening to slice his own hands with every sawing motion. Several times he had to pause and feel along the rope to ensure he was cutting in the right place, while the sound of his efforts seemed unnaturally loud in the confined space. Above them, the footsteps continued their restless pacing, accompanied by occasional bursts of conversation that spoke of growing impatience among the gang members. How long would it be before they decided that more direct methods were necessary to extract the information they sought? "They've been digging all over the property," Gary whispered as Rip worked. "Started with the barn, then moved to the house cellar, then the area around the well. Getting more frustrated every day when they don't find nothing." "Desperate men do desperate things," Rip replied grimly, feeling the first strand of rope part under his improvised blade. "And these boys are about as desperate as they come." The sound of the dugout door being unbarred froze all three prisoners in place. Light spilled down the wooden steps as someone descended with a lantern, casting dancing shadows across the stone walls. Rip quickly concealed the glass shard beneath his body while trying to position himself so that his work on the ropes would not be immediately obvious. Kuznic's fever-bright eyes gleamed in the lantern light as he surveyed his captives with the expression of a man examining livestock at market. His right hand rested casually on his gun butt, while his left held the lantern high enough to illuminate every corner of their prison. "Well now," he said in a voice that managed to be both soft and terrifying. "Looks like our little family has grown by one. Hope you're all getting properly acquainted down here, 'cause we got some serious talking to do real soon." His gaze lingered on Sue Grayson with an intensity that made Rip's skin crawl. Whatever restraint had kept the gang from more extreme measures was clearly beginning to weaken under the pressure of their unsuccessful search. "Boss says we've wasted enough time being gentle," Kuznic continued, his smile revealing teeth like yellow tombstones. "Time to try some methods that might be more persuasive. Starting with the lady here." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, promising horrors that would haunt survivors long after physical wounds had healed. In the lantern's flickering light, Rip could see the terror in Sue's eyes warring with a determination that spoke of frontier courage and stubborn pride. Time was running out faster than water through a broken dam. Chapter 7. "Now hold on a minute." Gary Grayson's voice was a low growl, a sound of pure fury strained through the gag that bit into the corners of his mouth. He surged against his ropes, the thick hemp groaning as his muscles bunched and fought for a freedom they could not win. Every ounce of his being was focused on the tall, gaunt form of Kuznic, whose fever-bright eyes still lingered on Sue. Kuznic's lips peeled back from his yellowed teeth in something that was not a smile. It was the expression a wolf might wear upon cornering a fawn. "You ain't in a position to be holding on to much of anything, rancher. Except maybe the sound of your woman screaming. That's a sound a man remembers." He shifted his weight, the leather of his gun belt creaking in the close, musty air of the dugout. "The boss is tired of waiting. Says we're done asking. Time to start taking." Sue Grayson did not scream. She met Kuznic's predatory gaze with a look of cold fire, her chin held high. The terror was there, deep in her eyes, but it was walled behind a rampart of frontier grit that Rip had seen in the very best of them, the ones who endured. It was a courage that shamed the casual brutality of men like Kuznic, and for a moment, the outlaw's foul confidence seemed to waver. Rip Campbell remained deathly still, a coiled spring of calculated violence waiting for the single fleeting moment when the odds might turn. His mind was a whirlwind of angles, possibilities, and the grim mathematics of a 3-on-1 fight in a black-walled tomb. The shard of glass was a secret, a sharp and desperate hope digging into the palm of his hand. He had made progress on Gary's bonds, but not enough. Not yet. "I'll get the poker," Kuznic said, turning his gaze from Sue with a visible effort. He seemed to relish the fear he was sowing, drawing it out like a fine cigar. "Ludlow's got a good fire going in the cook stove. We'll get it glowing a nice cherry red. A pretty color for a pretty lady, eh?" He laughed, a dry, rattling sound, and turned for the stairs. "Don't you folks go nowhere." The heavy door slammed shut, and the bar thudded back into place. Darkness, absolute and suffocating, reclaimed the dugout. The silence that followed was broken only by the ragged sound of breathing and the frantic rhythmic rasp of glass against fiber as Rip went to work with a renewed, savage urgency. "Rip, you got to get her out of here," Gary whispered, his voice cracking with helpless rage. "Forget me. Just get Sue out." "We all go, or none of us do," Rip hissed back, his knuckles raw as he sawed at the thick rope. The glass was slick with his own sweat. "He'll be back in minutes. I need more time." "There's no time." Gary strained against the ropes again, a futile, desperate act of a caged animal. From the floor beside him, Rip's questing fingers, which had earlier found the glass, brushed against another relic of the dugout's past. It was smooth, cool, and cylindrical. An old pickle jar, left over from a previous winter's stores. Its metal lid was rusted tight, but the glass was thick and intact. It was heavy. It was a weapon. An idea, wild and born of pure desperation, exploded in his mind. It was a fool's chance, but it was the only one they had. The heavy bar scraped against the wood of the doorframe upstairs. Light, thin and yellow, sliced down the steps. "It's now or never," Rip whispered, his fingers closing around the cool glass of the jar. "When they get to the bottom, I'm going to create a disturbance. Be ready for anything." Kuznic did not come back alone. The hulking shadow of the tattooed sailor followed him down the narrow steps, and between them they carried the instrument of their persuasion. It was a long, wrought iron branding iron, the kind used for marking cattle, its end glowing with a malevolent, pulsing red light that seemed to suck the oxygen from the air. The faint sizzle of its heat was a terrifying whisper in the close confines of the cellar. "All right, ma'am," Kuznic said, his voice dripping with false pleasantry as he reached the dirt floor. He held the glowing iron aloft like a torch. "We can do this easy, or we can do this hard. Where did Ezra Blackwood hide the money?" Sue's answer was a defiant spit that landed on the dirt near his boots. Kuznic's face hardened. "Hard it is, then." He took a step toward her. The sailor moved to flank him, holding the lantern high, his scarred face split by a vicious grin. That was the moment Rip chose. With a roar that was part fury and part prayer, he surged to his feet. He was not aiming for the men. He was aiming for the wall behind them. With all the force his wiry frame could muster, he hurled the heavy pickle jar. It flew through the air, a dark projectile arcing through the lantern light, and shattered against the stone wall a foot above the sailor's head. The explosion of sound was deafening in the enclosed space. The jar disintegrated into 1,000 glittering fragments. A shower of thick, briny liquid and chunks of pickled onion rained down on the two outlaws. The sailor cried out in surprise, stumbling back as the cold, vinegary slop hit his face and chest. He dropped the lantern. It hit the floor with a crash of glass and a spatter of burning oil. The flame sputtered, flared wildly, and died. The dugout was plunged into a terrifying, disorienting blackness, pierced only by the hellish, dull red glow of the branding iron in Kuznic's hand. In that single, chaotic second of blindness and confusion, Rip threw himself back to Gary's side. He gave the last, fraying strand of rope a final, desperate jerk. It snapped. Gary Grayson was free. "Now!" Rip yelled, and they lunged forward into the dark. It was not a fight. It was a maelstrom. A tangle of limbs and desperate, grunting fury in the suffocating black. Rip crashed into Kuznic, his shoulder driving hard into the outlaw's midsection. The glowing branding iron clattered against the stone wall, its heat scorching Rip's sleeve as it fell. He heard Gary let out a guttural cry as he tackled the sailor, and the two of them slammed into the far wall with a heavy bone-jarring thud. Rip grappled with Kuznic, his hands searching for a throat, a weapon, anything. The outlaw was wiry but strong, his fists lashing out blindly, one catching Rip high on the cheekbone, sending a starburst of pain through his skull. They fell to the floor, rolling in the dirt and debris, the air punched from their lungs. Then, above the grunts and the thuds of the struggle, came a new sound. A metallic clatter, followed by the scrape of steel on the hard-packed earth. Kuznic's pistol, jolted from its holster in the fall, had skidded away into the darkness. 4 hands scrambled for it at once. In the pitch black, Rip's desperate fingers brushed against the cold, unforgiving steel of the barrel. Chapter 8. Die, you son of a... Kuznic's curse was a raw, guttural sound, choked off as Rip's fingers locked around the cold steel of the pistol. There was no time for thought, no time for aiming. There was only the feral, desperate instinct for survival. Kuznic's hand clamped down over his, the man's wiry strength astonishing. They wrestled for the weapon in the suffocating, absolute dark, a frantic, unseen ballet of death. The pistol was trapped between them, a cold promise caught in the press of their bodies. Rip twisted his wrist with a surge of adrenaline-fueled power, a movement born of years spent wrestling with stubborn windmill gears and heavy machinery. The barrel of the Colt scraped against Kuznic's ribs, turning inward. Rip's thumb found the hammer, already cocked from the fall, and his index finger squeezed into the trigger guard. He pulled. The explosion was a physical blow, a concussive force that slammed into Rip's eardrums and seemed to lift him off the floor. The muzzle flash, a brilliant orange blossom of fire and violence, lasted less than a second, but it burned a hellish tableau into his memory. He saw Kuznic's face inches from his own, eyes wide with a final, terminal surprise, his mouth open in a scream that was obliterated by the gunshot. He saw Gary Grayson, locked in a desperate struggle with the tattooed sailor, the bigger man's hands closing around Gary's throat. He saw Sue, a pale ghost against the far wall, her eyes wide with a horror that transcended sound. Then the darkness crashed back in, heavier and more complete than before. The ringing in Rip's ears was a high, piercing shriek. The acrid stench of burnt gunpowder filled his nostrils, thick and choking. Kuznic's body went limp. A dead weight sagged against Rip, a warm, wet stickiness spreading through the fabric of his own shirt. He shoved the body away, scrambling backward on his hands and knees, the pistol still clutched in his fist. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. Across the dugout, the struggle continued. A choked gasp, then the heavy thud of a fist striking flesh. "Gary!" Rip yelled, his voice sounding strange and distant through the ringing. He had no target, only a direction. The momentary vision from the muzzle flash was all he had. The sailor had been on the left, forcing Gary back against the stone wall. Rip raised the pistol, his hand shaking, and pointed it into the terrifying void. He couldn't risk a blind shot, he might hit Gary. A heavy grunt of pain came from the darkness, followed by the sailor's triumphant laugh. "Got you now, rancher. Your friend just bought you a few more seconds of life, that's all." Rip saw it then. A faint, dull red glow moving in the dark. The branding iron. The sailor must have kicked it or rolled over it. It wasn't much, but it was a point of reference. It illuminated a small patch of dirt floor and the scuffed toe of one of the sailor's boots. The boot moved. Rip aimed just above it, leading the motion, picturing the man's torso in the blackness. He held his breath and fired again. The second gunshot was as deafening as the first. The muzzle flash revealed the sailor staggering backward, a look of profound shock on his scarred face. His hands flew to his chest, where a dark stain was already blossoming on his shirt. He stood for a long second, swaying like a felled tree, and then collapsed sideways, landing with a heavy final thud. Silence. A profound, ringing absolute silence, broken only by Rip's own ragged breathing. The air was a foul cocktail of dust, stale earth, and the sharp, metallic tang of blood and gunsmoke. The faint red glow of the branding iron was the only thing visible, a lone ember in a cold, dead world. "Gary." Rip's voice was a strained whisper. A groan came from near the wall. "Here. I'm here." A pause, then, "Is he?" "He's done," Rip said. He felt a wave of nausea and pushed it down. He pushed everything down. There would be time for sickness later. Now was for survival. "Sue, are you all right?" "Yes," she answered, her voice trembling but steady. "Oh God, Rip." Rip found his feet, stumbling in the dark until his hand found the cold stone of the wall. He used it to guide himself toward her voice. His fingers brushed against the ropes binding her ankles. "Don't move. I've got the glass here somewhere." He knelt, his hands patting the dirt floor, his fingers sticky with Kuznic's blood. He found the sharp-edged shard and began to saw at her bonds. Upstairs, a floorboard creaked. A voice, thick with menace, bellowed down. It was Ludlow. "Kuznic. What in blazes is going on down there?" There was no answer from the dead men on the floor. "Answer me, damn you!" Ludlow roared. Rip worked faster, the glass slicing into the rope. "They heard the shots," he whispered urgently. "They'll be coming." The bar on the outside of the door scraped, loud and ominous. "The stairs are a death trap," Gary breathed from the darkness. He had found his way to Sue's other side. "He'll shoot us down like fish in a barrel." The rope on Sue's ankles gave way. Rip moved to her hands. The bar outside was being lifted. Heavy, deliberate. Ludlow was being cautious. "There's no other way out," Gary said, his voice laced with despair. "Maybe there is," Sue said, her voice tight. "The old vent. My father-in-law built a small ventilation shaft. In the back corner. Behind the old potato bins. Said it was in case of a fire." The door at the top of the stairs creaked open. A sliver of lantern light cut through the oppressive black. "No time," Rip grunted, slicing the last of Sue's bonds. "We make a stand here, we die here. We've got 1 gun and 4 shots left. We have to go now." He grabbed Sue's hand, pulling her to her feet. "Gary, stay behind me. When I go, you and Sue follow. Don't stop for anything." He crept to the bottom of the narrow wooden stairs, peering up into the light. He could see Ludlow's boots and the bottom of his trousers. The man was standing just to the side of the opening, using the doorframe as cover. Rip took a deep breath, the foul air searing his lungs. He gave Gary's shoulder a squeeze, then burst up the stairs, the Colt held out in front of him. He was a whirlwind of motion, a desperate gamble in motion. He didn't aim for Ludlow, but for the lantern the man had placed on the floor beside him. He fired once. The lantern exploded, showering the kitchen in burning oil and shattered glass. Darkness fell again, this time a chaotic, flickering gloom, as small fires began to lick at the wooden floorboards. Ludlow yelled in surprise and pain, as a shard of glass sliced his arm. Rip was already moving, diving to the side, rolling behind the heavy oak kitchen table. Gary and Sue scrambled up the stairs behind him, their running footsteps loud on the wooden planks. "Get them!" Ludlow screamed. A gun roared from the far side of the kitchen, the bullet splintering the leg of the table Rip was hiding behind. The fourth man. The poker player. Rip peered around the edge of the table. In the flickering firelight, he saw Ludlow clutching his arm, blood welling between his fingers. The poker player was leveling his pistol for another shot. Rip fired, the bullet striking the man in the shoulder and spinning him around. He staggered back, dropping his gun with a cry of pain, and stumbled out the back door into the night. Ludlow, bellowing in rage, fired one last wild shot that buried itself in the ceiling, then turned and followed his wounded comrade, disappearing into the darkness. "They'll be back," he screamed, his voice receding into the night. "I swear on my brother's grave, I'll be back. I'll burn this whole ranch to the ground with you in it." Rip, Gary, and Sue were left in the flickering, firelit kitchen, the smell of blood, smoke, and burning oil thick in the air. The small fires from the lantern were spreading, crawling up a set of gingham curtains. Gary grabbed a water bucket from beside the sink and began beating at the flames. Rip stood, the smoking pistol feeling unnaturally heavy in his hand, and moved toward the front door, peering out into the vast, unforgiving darkness of the ranch yard. The immediate danger had passed, but Ludlow's promise echoed in the night air, a vow of vengeance that meant their fight for the Duckfoot Ranch had only just begun. Chapter 9. Is it out? Sue's voice was raspy from the smoke, her question cutting through the tense quiet of the kitchen. She stood with a rifle clutched in her hands, her back to the main door, her silhouette framed against the star-dusted darkness of the ranch yard. Gary Grayson dropped the scorched, sopping remains of a horse blanket onto the floor and wiped a soot-blackened hand across his forehead, leaving a dark smear. "It's out. For now." He kicked at a smoldering floorboard, sending a puff of gray ash into the air. The small fires were extinguished, but the kitchen was a wreck, reeking of burnt oil and violence. 2 dark stains marred the floorboards near the cellar door, grim reminders of the men who had died there. Rip Campbell stood by the shattered window, reloading the 2 spent cartridges in his Colt with fresh ones from his gun belt. The familiar, precise clicks of the loading gate were a small island of order in the sea of chaos. His cheek throbbed where Kuznic's fist had connected, and his shirt was stiff with drying blood that was not his own. "They won't have gone far," Rip said, his voice low and hard. "Ludlow's wounded, and so is the other one." But he meant what he said. "He'll be back." "Let him come," Gary said, his jaw set like granite. He found his own rifle, leaning where he'd left it against the wall before the attack. He checked its action with a practiced familiarity that was both comforting and chilling. The rancher had been forced to become a soldier in his own home. "This is our land. We're done running." The truth of his words hung in the air, as stark and real as the 2 bodies in the cellar below. There was no more running. There was only the fight that was to come. A low, mournful sound drifted in through the broken window from the darkness outside. It was a sound that had been a constant, miserable backdrop to the horror, the desperate, thirsty bawling of the cattle. "The herd," Sue said softly, turning from her post at the door. "They can't last much longer, Gary." The sound seemed to cut through Gary's rage, reminding him of a duty that went beyond vengeance. He was a rancher before he was a fighter. His wealth, his future, his entire life's work was out there in the dark, dying on its feet. "The windmill," he said, looking at Rip. "Ludlow said you sold it to me. Said you guaranteed it." Rip nodded slowly. "I did. And I stand by my work. We need light." They found an unshattered lantern in the pantry, and with the flame turned low, made their way outside. The night air was cool, a welcome relief from the smoky kitchen. The vast, silent prairie stretched out around them, a beautiful and terrifying expanse under a canopy of cold, indifferent stars. The lowing of the cattle grew louder, more insistent, as they caught the scent of the humans. The windmill stood against the sky like a skeletal giant, its blades still and silent. It was a monument to the ranch's failure, the very heart of the operation having ceased to beat. "I'll need my tools," Rip said. "They'll be with my horse, if he hasn't been spooked." He gave a low, 2-toned whistle into the darkness toward the cottonwoods. A moment later, a soft nicker answered, and the familiar shape of Sandy trotted into the dim circle of lantern light. The big gelding was skittish, but he came to Rip's hand. Strapped behind the saddle was Rip's livelihood, a long leather roll containing the specialized wrenches, gauges, and pliers of the windmill trade. He unstrapped it and spread it on the ground. To Gary, it was a jumble of strange-looking implements. To Rip, each tool was an old friend with a specific purpose. Sue, you stay back by the house, Gary commanded gently. Keep watch. Sing out if you see anything, you hear? She nodded, her face grim, and retreated into the shadows, the rifle held at the ready. All right, Rip said, picking up a heavy wrench. Let's see what's ailing this patient. First thing is to check the gearbox. He began to climb the steel lattice of the tower, moving with the easy confidence of a man in his natural element. Gary held the lantern below, its light stretching Rip's shadow up the framework. High above the ground, Rip laid his hands on the cold metal of the nacelle. He worked the inspection plate loose and peered inside. The gears were fine, well greased and undamaged. It's not the head, he called down. Something's wrong with the pump itself. The sucker rod is jammed solid. He climbed back down, his boots ringing on the metal rungs. We're going to have to pull the pipe. It was heavy, back-breaking work. The long sections of galvanized pipe were heavy and slick. Using a block and tackle from Rip's kit, they hoisted the pipe assembly, foot by laborious foot, out of the well casing. The metal screeched in protest, the sound grating on nerves already stretched thin. They worked in a small bubble of lantern light, acutely aware of the vast, watching darkness that surrounded them, a darkness that could be hiding Lello and his gun. Finally, with a great, sucking groan, the bottom of the pipe cleared the wellhead, bringing with it the pump cylinder and the foot valve. And the problem was immediately, glaringly obvious. What in God's name? Gary breathed, staring. The foot valve, the mechanism that allows water to be drawn up but not fall back down, was completely blocked. It was jammed with a greasy, dark mass that was not rock or mud or any kind of natural obstruction Rip had ever seen. He knelt, poking at the blockage with the tip of a screwdriver. It was soft but dense. He got a grip on a corner of it and pulled. It resisted, wedged tight in the cylinder. He braced his feet and pulled harder. With a wet, tearing sound, a bundle came free in his hands. It was a package, about the size of a brick, wrapped in oilskin and tied securely with wax twine. It was heavy, and it had been shoved down the pipe with tremendous force. Behind it, he could see another and another. The entire pump was choked with them. With a growing sense of dread and dawning comprehension, Rip set the first bundle on the ground. His hands, slick with well water and grease, worked at the twine. He broke a fingernail, prying it loose. He tore away the oilskin. Inside, wrapped in another layer of canvas, was a tightly bound stack of United States banknotes. 50s. Hundreds. More money than he had ever seen in one place. Gary stared, his mouth agape, his eyes reflecting the lantern light. The money, he whispered, the words catching in his throat. The $30,000. Rip tore open a second package, and a third. They were all the same. Stacks of cash packed tight, preserved against the damp by the oilskin. Ezra Blackwood, Rip said, his mind putting the pieces together. He must have been the one who robbed the bank with them. Maybe he got wounded, or there was a falling out. He got here, knew he was dying or that they were on his trail. He needed to hide the money, fast. So he stuffed it down the well, Gary finished, his voice full of awe and horror. Shoved it right down the pipe. And it got stuck, Rip said, looking at the clogged pump cylinder. Jammed the valve, broke the sucker rod when the wind tried to turn the blades. The very thing they were killing for was the reason the windmill was broken in the first place. They stood in silence, the two of them, staring at the fortune lying at their feet. It was a treasure that had spawned a manhunt across 3 territories, that had brought torture and death to their doorstep, that had turned their peaceful ranch into a battlefield. It was a curse made of paper and ink. From the darkness, the cattle lowed again, a chorus of profound misery. The sound cut through the spell. The water. They still had no water. Rip looked from the money to the pump, then back to the money. He picked up a wrench. Let's get the rest of this poison out of the pipe, Gary. Your herd is still thirsty. Chapter 10. It's too quiet. Sue Grayson spoke the words from the doorway of the barn, her voice barely a whisper, yet it carried across the ranch yard with the clarity of a ringing bell. 2 days had passed since the night of blood and fire. 2 days of waiting. The silence she spoke of was not peace, it was the held breath before a storm. The Duckfoot Ranch had become a fortress. Windows were barricaded, sight lines were cleared, and loaded rifles leaned in every corner of every room. The bodies of Kuznic and the sailor had been dragged far from the house and buried in shallow, unmarked graves, a grim task performed in the gray light of dawn. The $30,000, a fortune that felt more like a lead weight, was hidden away in the darkest corner of the cellar, its presence a constant unspoken poison in the air. Rip Campbell, cleaning his Colt by the faint light of a lantern, looked up from his work. He'd seen this kind of quiet before, in railroad towns waiting for a strike to break, and in settlements bracing for an Indian raid. It was a wire pulled taut, vibrating with a tension that frayed the nerves and hollowed out the soul. "Quiet is what they want," he said. "They want us jumpy. They want us to make a mistake." Gary Grayson paced the length of the porch, his boots echoing a restless, caged rhythm. He hadn't slept more than an hour at a time, his face drawn and pale beneath a 2-day growth of beard. What are we waiting for? For them to ride down on us in force? We're blind, Rip. We know Lello and the card sharp got away, but we don't know how many more there are. We don't know who they are. And that, Rip said, snapping the cylinder of his pistol shut, is a problem we need to solve. He stood up, his decision made. I'm going into Nutgrass. Sue turned from the barn, her expression sharp with alarm. You can't. They could be watching the road. It's what they'd expect. Exactly, Rip agreed. They'll expect me to be hunkered down, scared. They won't expect one of us to ride bold as brass into town in broad daylight. I need supplies, and more than that, I need information. A man can't fight shadows, and right now, that's all we're up against. The argument was sound, and they all knew it. To stay at the ranch was to be pinned down, waiting for an enemy of unknown strength to choose the time and place of the next battle. To move was to take a risk, but it was also to take back a sliver of control. An hour later, Rip was in the saddle, Sandy moving at a steady, ground-eating trot. He didn't take the shortcut through Devil's Canyon. He stayed on the main road, a solitary figure in the vast open country, feeling 1,000 unseen eyes on his back. Every rock formation, every dip in the terrain could hold an ambush. He rode with his rifle across his lap, his gaze constantly sweeping the horizon. But the journey passed without incident, the silence of the prairie broken only by the wind and the rhythmic beat of Sandy's hooves. Nutgrass was a dusty collection of false-fronted buildings, huddled along a single main street, a typical frontier town wrestling with its own growing pains. Rip tied Sandy in front of the general store and stepped inside, the jingle of the bell over the door sounding unnaturally loud. He bought coffee, salt, and a box of .44 to 40 cartridges, exchanging terse pleasantries with the storekeeper. He listened intently to the low murmur of conversation from 2 ranchers near the back, but heard nothing of use, just talk of dry weather and cattle prices. He left the store and crossed the dusty street to the saloon. It was still early, and the place was mostly empty. A few cowhands nursed beers at the bar, and a pair of drummers played a listless game of cards at a corner table. Rip ordered a beer he didn't want, and took a seat at a table near the back, one that gave him a clear view of the room and the batwing doors. On a nearby table lay a discarded copy of the Territorial Clarion, the weekly newspaper from the capital. It was 2 weeks old, creased and stained with rings from a wet glass. Rip picked it up. Most of it was territorial politics and advertisements for patent medicines. But on the 3rd page, a headline caught his eye: Black Creek bank robbery leaves 3 dead. Kuznic Gang suspected. Rip's blood went cold. He scanned the article, his eyes devouring the dense columns of type. The story laid out the brutal facts of a robbery that had happened nearly a month prior. 5 men had hit the bank in Black Creek, a mining town 200 miles to the east. They'd killed the bank manager and a deputy in the process. A posse had given chase, and in the running gunfight that followed, a 3rd deputy had been killed before the gang escaped into the Badlands with an estimated $30,000. The article listed the known members of the gang. The names hit Rip like physical blows. The leader was identified as Jedediah Kuznic. His brothers were listed as Abel, the tall, fever-eyed man Rip had seen in the barn, and Lello. There were 2 other known associates. The first was Ezra Blackwood, a former prospector known for his solitary nature, who the authorities believed had planned the robbery. The second was a gambler and gunman known only as Silas, infamous for his skill with a deck of cards and a pistol. It was all there. The dead men in the dugout and the barn were Abel Kuznic and the hired gun, the sailor. The men who had escaped were Lello Kuznic, the last of the brothers, and the card-sharp Silas. Ezra Blackwood, their inside man, had made it to the Duckfoot with the money before dying, leaving a deadly inheritance for the Graysons. Rip folded the newspaper carefully and tucked it inside his coat. He now had the names of his enemies. He knew the crime that drove them. But as he sat there, the pieces of the puzzle began to form a much larger, more disturbing picture. He turned his attention back to the conversations in the room. 2 grizzled prospectors at the bar were talking in low, guarded tones. Rip strained to listen over the clink of glasses. "Told him to pay up," one of the men was saying. "Told him it was for protection. Said his claim was on land controlled by the syndicate." "Syndicate?" the other man scoffed. "Since when do we have syndicates out here? This ain't Chicago." "It is now," the first man said grimly. "This ain't just a few road agents, Tom. This is organized. They got men everywhere. Heard they even got a friend or 2 in the territorial marshal's office. A man makes a complaint, and somehow the complaint gets lost. Next thing you know, the man who complained goes missing." The second man fell silent, nursing his whiskey with a worried look. A syndicate. A larger network. A law office that couldn't be trusted. The words connected in Rip's mind with the cold, final click of a coffin lid shutting. This wasn't just about Lello and Silas trying to recover their stolen loot. They were part of something bigger. Something with reach, with power. Something that could make a windmill salesman and 2 dirt ranchers disappear without a trace. The weight of this new knowledge was heavier than any bag of supplies. He had come to town seeking answers and found a nightmare. He was no longer just fighting a handful of desperate outlaws. He was fighting an army that operated from the shadows, an army whose soldiers might even be wearing badges. He finished his beer, left 2 coins on the table, and walked out into the harsh afternoon sun. The ride back to the Duckfoot Ranch felt twice as long as the ride into town. He carried with him not just coffee and cartridges, but a terrible certainty. He was riding back to tell Gary and Sue that their war had just gotten bigger, the odds longer, and that the long, quiet wait was about to end. The shadows from the past were gathering, and they were about to fall over the Duckfoot Ranch with a vengeance. Chapter 11. The rider appeared out of the shimmering heat of the 3rd morning, a lone dark speck growing steadily against the vast, sun-bleached canvas of the plains. It was Gary who saw him first from the roof of the barn, where he'd taken to keeping watch. The rider wasn't moving with the skulking caution of an outlaw, but with the steady, unhurried pace of a man who believed the badge on his chest made him immune to the evils that lurked in the landscape. "It's the sheriff," he called down, his voice tight with a mixture of relief and apprehension. "Sheriff Blevens from Nutgrass." Rip Campbell emerged from the cool shadows of the house, squinting into the glare. He had argued against this. After his return from town, He'd laid out the grim truth of their situation. They were entangled with a syndicate, a shadowy organization with long arms that might even reach into the halls of justice. But Gary Grayson, for all the horror he had endured, was a man who still believed in the law. He had ridden out before dawn the previous day, leaving a note saying he was going for the only help he trusted. Now, his faith was riding back toward him in the form of a portly middle-aged man on a tired-looking sorrel. They met him in the yard. Sheriff Gus Blevens was a man whose body had long since surrendered to gravity and his wife's cooking. His face was fleshy and perpetually sweating, and his gun belt seemed to be fighting a losing battle with the swell of his belly. But his eyes, small and buried in puffy flesh, were sharp. They missed nothing. They took in the barricaded windows, the raw, defensive posture of the three people who greeted him, and the unnatural quiet of the ranch. "Gary," Blevens said, swinging a leg stiffly over his saddle. His joints popped audibly. "Your boy rode in yesterday, talking some wild story. Said you had trouble out here. Figured I'd best come see for myself." His gaze settled on Rip. "Don't believe we've had the pleasure. You must be the windmill man he mentioned." "Rip Campbell," Rip said, offering a curt nod. "Well, Mr. Campbell," the sheriff said, his gaze lingering on Rip's Colt. "Let's all go inside, and you can tell me why this place looks like it's getting ready to stand off the entire Sioux Nation." In the tense quiet of the kitchen, they told him everything. They started with Ludlow's arrival and the lie about the sale, then the ambush in the canyon, the discovery of the Graysons in the barn, the fight in the dugout. Gary recounted the events with a plain, factual anger. Rip filled in the details, laying the old copy of the Territorial Clarion on the table. He pointed to the names, Kuznic, Blackwood, Silas, and explained the connection to the Black Creek robbery and the $30,000. He told the sheriff what he'd overheard in the saloon, about the syndicate and the whispers of corrupted officials. Sheriff Blevens listened without interruption. He picked up the newspaper, his lips moving silently as he read. He leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking in protest, and steepled his fingers over his considerable stomach. The silence stretched. "That's a hell of a story, boys," he said at last, his voice a low rumble. "A genuine, dyed-in-the-wool penny dreadful. Got everything but the train robbery and the runaway dam." "It's the God's honest truth, Gus," Gary said, leaning forward, his hands flat on the table. "We've got two of them, buried out past the creek to prove it." Blevens's eyes narrowed. "You buried them? Without notifying the law?" "Gary, that's irregular. That complicates things. We were a little busy trying not to get killed, to worry about legal niceties," Rip cut in, his voice sharp. The sheriff sighed, a long, weary sound, like air leaking from a punctured feed sack. "Let's get a few things straight. What you have here," he said, tapping a thick finger on the newspaper, "is an article. Hearsay. What you have from the saloon is gossip. What you don't have is proof of any of this syndicate business." He shifted his gaze to Gary. "What you do have, by your own admission, is a fortune in stolen bank money in your cellar and 2 dead men on your property. Men you can't prove shot at you first, because the only other witnesses are you and your wife." "And me," Rip said. "A transient," Blevens countered, not unkindly. "A man with no ties here. A jury might find that convenient." The room grew cold. The sheriff wasn't seeing them as victims. He was seeing them as a problem, a knot of violence and trouble that had landed squarely in his jurisdiction. "What are you saying, Gus?" Sue asked, speaking for the first time. She had been standing by the stove, a silent, watchful presence. "Are you saying you don't believe us?" "I'm saying this is a tangled mess, Sue," Blevens said, his tone softening slightly. "I'm a town sheriff. I deal with drunks on Saturday night and stray dogs. You're asking me to believe there's a secret army of killers running around my county. An army connected to men in the territorial capital. You're not asking me to make an arrest. You're asking me to declare a war. A war one got no men for, no authority for, and no stomach for. He stood up and walked to the door, looking out at the vast empty prairie. I know the Kuznic's name. Not from any newspaper. They passed through here last year. Caused no trouble, but I saw them. The kind of men that walk soft, but carry a big shadow. The kind of men a smart sheriff leaves alone unless they force his hand. He turned back to face them, and in his eyes Rip saw not cowardice, but a profound and weary practicality. You bring me Lello Kuznic and this Silas character, and I'll lock them up. You show me where the sun rises in the west, and I'll swear to it in court. But I will not ride my horse into a gunfight I can't win. I will not get my town shot to pieces over $30,000 that was never ours to begin with. So you're going to do nothing? Gary demanded, his voice thick with disbelief. I'm going to go back to town and file a report, the sheriff said. A very carefully worded report. And I'm going to give you some advice, as a friend. Take that money. The whole damn pile of it. Ride to the capital, turn it over to the territorial marshal himself, and tell him your story. Let this become his problem. Because if you keep that money here, if you try to be heroes, the only thing that will come back to this ranch is more death. And next time, it might be yours. He walked out the door without another word. They watched through the window as he mounted his horse. He didn't look back. He just settled his bulk into the saddle and pointed his sorrel toward Nutgrass, a solitary lawman retreating from a lawless situation. The three of them stood in the kitchen, the silence ringing with the sheriff's inspoken words. He hadn't just refused to help. He had confirmed Rip's deepest fears. He had shown them the boundary of the law, and they were on the wrong side of it. They were alone, isolated on a small patch of land with a fortune in cursed money beneath their feet and a promise of vengeance riding on the wind. The law had come and gone, and had left them nothing but the cold, hard certainty that their survival rested entirely in their own hands. Chapter 12. So that's it then. Gary Grayson's voice was flat, stripped of all emotion but a cold, hard anger that had been simmering for days. He stood at the kitchen window, staring out at the empty track of road where Sheriff Blevens had vanished. The law has washed its hands of us. We're on our own. We were always on our own, Gary. Sue's reply was quiet, but it held the strength of tempered steel. She was cleaning the barrel of a rifle with a calm, methodical precision that belied the tremor in her hands. The law is a far-off thing in this country. We've always known that. It's why we built this house with thick walls and a strong door. Rip Campbell watched them both, a grim understanding settling in his gut. The sheriff's visit had done more than just deny them aid. It had cauterized their last hope of a civilized solution. It had stripped away the thin veneer of order and left them with the raw, elemental truth of their predicament. They were an island, and the sea was rising. Blevens's advice was sound in its way, Rip said, his voice a low counterpoint to Gary's anger. Taking the money and running might be the smartest play. Run where? Gary spun away from the window, his face a mask of fury and exhaustion. Run from our own home. Let men like Lello burn it to the ground. No. By God, no. My father broke this ground with his bare hands. I buried him on that hill over there. This is my place. If I die, I'll die here. Then we don't die, Rip said simply. His gaze was steady, meeting Gary's fire with a cool, calculating resolve. We fight. But we fight smart. We assume they're coming back. We assume they're coming back with friends. And we get ready. The friends arrived 2 days later. It began not with the sound of hoofbeats, but with a change in the light. A haze on the eastern horizon, a smudge of brown dust against the pure blue of the morning sky that was too thick, too persistent to be a dust devil. It grew slowly, deliberately, a rising cloud kicked up by the shod hooves of many horses. Not two riders returning, but a small army. Rip saw it from the barn roof. He didn't shout. He didn't raise an alarm. He simply slid down the ladder, his face grim. "They're here," he said to Gary, who was reinforcing the corral gate. "Looks like a half-dozen, maybe more." They watched from the windows of the house, the three of them, as the riders came on. They moved with a purpose that was terrifying to behold. They fanned out as they approached, not in a charge, but in a wide, encircling maneuver like wolves working a herd. These were not the desperate, brawling men of the original gang. These were riders of a different caliber. They were hard men, recruited from the dusty, sun-scorched towns that festered along the border. They wore their guns with a casual intimacy, their hats pulled low against the glare, their faces burned to the color of old leather. They rode with an economy of motion that spoke of long, brutal years in the saddle. They were professionals. One by one, they took up positions. Two riders vanished into the cluster of sandstone formations to the south, the same rocks where the Mexican gunman had laid his ambush. Another pair dismounted and settled in on the low ridge to the west, the last place Rip had seen the ranch from before his ride into Devil's Canyon. They commanded the high ground, their rifles glinting in the sun. The main road to Nutgrass was now sealed. Then two more figures rode forward, stopping just out of easy rifle range. Even from that distance, there was no mistaking the massive, bear-like frame of Lello Kuznic. Beside him sat the gambler, Silas, looking as calm and unruffled as if he were about to sit down to a game of faro. "Grayson." Ludlow's voice boomed across the open ground, a raw, powerful roar of command. "Campbell. I know you're in there. I've come for what's mine." No one in the house answered. They watched, their knuckles white on their rifle stocks. "My brother is dead," Ludlow bellowed, a new ragged edge of fury in his voice. "You owe me for that. But I'm a reasonable man. Send out the money. All of it. You send out that money, and I'll let you live. I'll take what's mine and ride out. You have my word." "The word of a Kuznic," Gary muttered under his breath, his lip curling in a sneer. "Worth about as much as a cup of spit." Rip laid a hand on Gary's shoulder. "Let him talk. Let him tell us what he's thinking." "You got 1 hour, Grayson," Ludlow shouted, his voice echoing in the sudden, ringing silence. 1 hour to put the money in a sack and leave it on the porch. If it's not there, I'm going to start taking this place apart, one board at a time. And I'll start with the woman." Silas, the gambler, raised a hand, and one of the snipers on the western ridge fired. It wasn't a shot aimed to kill. It was a message. The bullet kicked up a puff of dust 10 feet from the porch steps, a perfectly placed punctuation mark to Ludlow's threat. The two men turned their horses and rode back to join their men, leaving the threat to hang in the air like a noose. The siege had begun. The ranch was surrounded, its lines of supply and escape severed. They were cut off from the world. Inside the house, the air was thick enough to taste. The vast open spaces of the ranch, once a symbol of freedom, had become a killing ground. Every window was a liability, every doorway a fatal shoot. "He'll do it," Sue said, her voice steady despite the gravity of the moment. "He'll burn us out." "Not if we don't let him," Rip said. He was scanning the landscape, his mind no longer that of a windmill salesman, but of a tactician measuring fields of fire. "They've made their first mistake." "Mistake?" Gary asked, incredulous. "They've got us pinned down, surrounded." "They split their forces," Rip explained, his gaze fixed on the sandstone rocks to the south. "They're confident. Overconfident. That sniper on the ridge is their eyes, but the two in the rocks are their hammer on that side. They think we'll just sit here and wait for them." He moved to the front room, the one with the thickest log walls, and peered through a small gap he'd made in the barricade. He rested the barrel of his rifle in the opening, the heavy octagonal barrel, cool and solid in his hands. He took his time, his breathing slow and even. He wasn't looking at the men on the ridge, or at Ludlow's main force. He was looking at a single, sun-blasted boulder among the formations to the south. He waited. For 5 minutes, nothing happened. Then, for just a second, a man's head and shoulders appeared from behind the rock as he shifted for a better view of the ranch house. It was a fleeting, momentary target. Rip didn't fire at the man. He fired at the rock face a foot to the man's right. The rifle bucked against his shoulder. The report was a flat, hard crack. Far out in the rocks, the bullet struck stone with a loud, angry smack, winding off into the sky and showering the hidden gunmen with chips of sandstone. The head ducked back out of sight with comical speed. A furious yell came from the rocks. A fusillade of answering shots erupted from all their positions at once, bullets thudding into the log walls of the house and splintering the frame of the barn. But Rip's shot had not been an act of random defiance. It was a statement. It was a counter-offer to Ludlow's ultimatum. It said, "We see you. We can touch you. And we are not afraid." It was the first move in turning the Duckfoot Ranch into a fortress. Rip levered a fresh round into the chamber, a thin smile touching his lips. He settled back behind the wall, ready for their next move. Chapter 13. The answer to Rip's shot was a roaring, instantaneous wave of lead. It was as if he had kicked a hornet's nest the size of a mountain. Bullets slapped into the thick log walls of the house with heavy percussive thuds that vibrated through the floorboards. They screamed past the windows with a vicious, high-pitched whine. A slug tore through the roof, sending a shower of splintered shingles and dust down into the kitchen. The air, which had been still and silent, was now filled with the deafening, rolling thunder of a half-dozen rifles firing at once. Gary and Sue were already moving, crouching low and scurrying away from the windows. They had lived with the threat for days, but this was the first full-throated taste of the gang's fury. This was not a warning shot. This was a statement of overwhelming force. "Get down," Rip yelled, though the command was unnecessary. He had dropped below the level of the windowsill the moment he'd fired, the log above his head absorbing 2 heavy-caliber rounds that would have torn through him. He crawled away from the wall, the floorboards vibrating under his hands. "They're just trying to scare us. Wasting lead." But it felt like more than that. It felt like the house itself was under assault from a malevolent hailstorm, the sheer volume of fire, a physical pressure against the walls. From the ridge, from the rocks, from their main position, Ludlow's men poured a relentless, disciplined fire into the ranch buildings. They were professionals, methodically targeting doors, windows, and anything that looked like a potential firing slit. The volley lasted for a full minute, then stopped as abruptly as it had begun. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was profound, broken only by the faint tinkle of a shattered pane of glass falling from its frame. In that quiet, a plan began to form in Rip's mind, a plan born not of military tactics, but of a mechanic's understanding of stress, leverage, and the practical application of force. He looked around the room, but he wasn't seeing a besieged farmhouse. He was seeing a worksite, full of materials and possibilities. "They think we're rabbits in a hole," he said, his voice quiet and intense. "They think we'll sit here and wait for them to get bored or bold. We need to change the geometry of this fight." "Change the geometry?" Gary asked, peering cautiously over the edge of a barricaded window. "What does that mean?" "It means we stop thinking of this place as a house and start thinking of it as a machine," Rip said. "A machine for defending ourselves." The work began, under the harsh glare of the midday sun. It was a desperate, calculated gamble. They had to assume the gang's snipers were watching their every move, yet they had no choice but to expose themselves. Rip moved first, scurrying from the house to the relative cover of the barn. A single rifle shot cracked from the ridge, kicking up dirt a few feet behind him, but he made it. Gary and Sue followed, moving in short, frantic bursts, until all three were gathered in the dusty, cavernous space of the barn. "First," Rip said, gesturing to the heavy, high-wheeled buckboard wagon parked near the doors. "We need cover that isn't anchored to the ground." It was brutal, back-breaking labor. They wrestled the heavy wagon out into the yard, positioning it at an angle between the house and the southern rocks. It wasn't much, but it broke up the open space, creating a new line of defense, an obstacle that could deflect bullets and hide a defender. They moved a second wagon, a heavy freight hauler, to cover the approach from the west. The snipers on the ridge peppered the area around them with sporadic shots, forcing them to duck and weave, their lungs burning, their muscles screaming in protest. But with every new piece of cover they moved, the ranch yard transformed. It was no longer a simple, open space. It was becoming a maze, a confusing jumble of angles and dead ends. Rip's real work began with the tools of his trade. He looked at the ranch not with a rancher's eye, but with a mechanic's. He saw the piles of discarded scrap metal, the rolls of barbed wire, the lengths of heavy chain. To him, these were not junk, they were components. "Gary, I need you to give me a hand with this," he said, pointing to a heavy-duty block and tackle hanging from a barn beam. "We're going to rig a surprise." He climbed the windmill tower again, this time hauling the end of a long, heavy chain with him. Under the intermittent fire of the gang, he worked with a calm, focused intensity. He secured the block and tackle near the top of the tower, then threaded the chain through it. The loose end, with a heavy, rusted plowshare attached to it, hung 50 feet in the air. The other end he ran down the back of the tower, concealing it in the grass, and anchoring it to a pin driven deep into the ground near the barn. "It's a deadfall," he explained to a bewildered Gary when he climbed back down. "The main path they'll take, if they charge from that direction, comes right under the tower. A man hiding in the barn can knock that pin loose with a sledgehammer. 100 pounds of chain and 50 pounds of iron falling from that high, it won't be pretty." Next came the wire. He took a spool of new barbed wire, and with Sue's help, began stringing it in patterns that made no sense for containing livestock. They ran it low to the ground, barely 6 inches high, through the tall, dry grass in the blind spots between the outbuildings. It wasn't a barrier. It was a tripwire, nearly invisible, designed to catch a running man's ankle in the dark and send him sprawling. He saw the ranch's resources with a unique eye. He had Gary and Sue fill a dozen empty barrels with dirt and sand, creating movable barricades they could roll into place to block a doorway or reinforce a corner. He took the big iron dinner bell that Sue used to call the hands in for meals and remounted it inside the house, running a thin, taut wire from its clapper out through a small hole in the wall and across the yard to the henhouse. "Another tripwire," he said. "If they try to circle around the back in the night, they'll hit that wire, and we'll get a wake-up call that'll raise the dead." The sun beat down, turning the ranch yard into a furnace. They worked through the heat, fueled by desperation and a growing, defiant hope. They were no longer just victims waiting for an attack. They were engineers of their own defense. They were taking the simple, sturdy tools of their life and forging them into weapons. Every nail hammered, every wire strung was an act of rebellion. As evening approached, casting long, distorted shadows across the transformed landscape, they stood in the doorway of the house, surveying their work. The Duckfoot Ranch was no longer a home. It was a fortress of ingenuity, a deadly machine built of wagons and wire, of chains and plows. It was a testament to the desperate creativity of a windmill salesman. The snipers on the ridge had fallen silent, likely watching this strange activity with a mixture of amusement and contempt. Gary Grayson looked at the bizarre, almost chaotic arrangement of barricades and traps. He shook his head, a slow smile touching his lips for the first time in days. "You know, Rip," he said, his voice laced with a weary, newfound respect, "I thought I was just buying a windmill from you." Chapter 14. I thought I was just buying a windmill from you. Gary Grayson's words hung in the twilight air, a testament to the strange and violent turn their lives had taken. The ranch yard, once a simple space of work and passage, had become a complex and deadly puzzle of his own making, and Rip Campbell felt a grim mechanic's pride in the construction. "A good machine has more than one purpose," Rip answered, his eyes scanning the darkening landscape. "Right now, the purpose of this one is to stay alive." He turned from the door, his face a mask of shadows in the dim lantern light. "But a machine is useless if the operator doesn't know how to run it. They'll wait for full dark. Then they'll come probing. They won't try a full charge, not yet. They'll send 1 or 2 men in, try to find the weak spots, test our nerve. Whatever you hear, whatever you see, you don't fire unless you have a clear target. A wasted shot tells them where you are. We wait for them to make the mistake." The waiting was a quiet, suffocating agony. Night fell not as a blanket, but as a predator, swallowing the last vestiges of color from the land and leaving a monochrome world of gray and black. Every gust of wind, whistling through a crack in the wall, sounded like a stealthy footstep. Every shadow, cast by the quarter moon, seemed to hold the shape of a crouching man. They took their positions, Gary in the front room, Sue in the kitchen, and Rip near the back, moving between windows, a ghost in his own fortress. Hours crawled by, each one a small eternity. The attack, when it came, was announced not by a gunshot, but by the frantic, jarring clamor of the dinner bell. The sound exploded into the stillness, a wild, metallic jangling from the side of the house that was so loud, so unexpected, it felt like a physical blow. Sue gasped, spinning around from her post, her rifle coming up. "Hold your fire," Rip hissed from the darkness across the room. "That's our man." The bell fell silent. A heartbeat later, a strangled cry of pain and surprise tore through the night from the direction of the henhouse, followed by a string of blistering curses. The tripwire. One of the prowlers had hit the wire connected to the bell, and in his surprise, had stumbled directly into the low-strung line of barbed wire hidden in the tall grass. Almost immediately, a rifle cracked from the southern rocks, the bullet aimed not at the house, but at the source of the cursing. It was covering fire, an attempt to suppress any response. "Now," Rip commanded. From her position, Sue fired a single, carefully aimed shot into the darkness just above the sound of the cursing man. She wasn't trying to hit him. She was trying to pin him. Gary opened up from the front of the house, laying 2 quick shots toward the muzzle flash from the rocks, forcing that rifleman to duck for cover. The night erupted. The man tangled in the wire screamed again, this time a sound of pure panic as he realized he was caught in a crossfire. Ludlow's men, thinking their comrade was under a full assault, opened up from all their positions. Bullets tore through the night air, converging on the area around the henhouse. They were firing at their own man. And in that maelstrom of noise and confusion, Rip Campbell slipped out the back door. He moved low and fast, a fleeting shadow in a world of violent noise. He didn't run toward the fight. He ran away from it, circling wide around the barn, using the new chaotic landscape of wagons and barrels as his cover. The outlaws' attention was completely focused on the front of the ranch, on the man they believed was trapped and dying. They had no eyes for the darkness behind them. Rip's knowledge of this land was now intimate, absolute. He knew every dip in the terrain, every rock, every patch of soft earth that would muffle a footstep. He moved with the silence of an owl, his pistol in his hand. His target was the western ridge, the position that commanded the clearest view of the ranch, and pinned them down most effectively. He knew, with a hunter's certainty, that while one man up there might be firing, the other would be watching the main house, his attention riveted. He came up on the ridge from behind, climbing the gentle grassy slope on his belly. The last 50 feet were open ground. He could hear the two men talking in low, urgent tones between rifle shots. "Get him out of there," one was saying. "Ludlow will have our hides if we lose another man," the other growled. "Keep their heads down." Another shot cracked, echoing across the valley. Rip rose to a low crouch. He was 20 feet behind them. He could have shot them both in the back. But the sound would alert Ludlow and Silas, and would rob him of the terror he intended to sow. He picked up a rock the size of his fist. He threw it hard, not at the men, but a dozen yards to their left, where it clattered loudly down a small shale deposit. "What was that?" The first man hissed, spinning around, his rifle swinging toward the sound. His partner turned a second later, and in that moment of distraction, Rip closed the distance. He moved with a speed that was terrifying, a blur of motion in the moonlight. He hit the second man like a charging bull, his shoulder driving hard into the man's back. The rifle flew from his hands as he pitched forward with a grunt of surprise. Rip didn't slow. The first man was still turning back from the false noise when Rip's left hand shot out, grabbing the barrel of his rifle and wrenching it aside. With his right, he drove the hard steel butt of his Colt in a short, brutal arc that connected with the man's temple. There was a sickening, hollow crunch. The man collapsed without a sound, a loose-jointed heap on the dusty ground. The second gunman was scrambling for his own rifle, his eyes wide with shock. Rip kicked it away. The man lunged, a knife appearing in his hand as if by magic. He was fast, but Rip had the advantage of momentum. He didn't try to fight the knife. He simply crashed into the man, wrapping his arms around him and using his weight to bear him to the ground. They rolled over once, the man's wiry strength surprising. The point of the knife scraped along Rip's ribs, tearing his shirt. But they were fighting on the edge of the ridge. With a final, desperate heave, Rip twisted his body and pushed. The outlaw's eyes went wide as he felt the ground disappear from beneath him. He scrabbled for a hold, his fingers clawing at Rip's shirt, but it was too late. With a choked cry, he tumbled backward over the edge, falling 15 feet down the steep incline and landing with a heavy final thud in the rocks below. Rip lay on the ground, his lungs heaving, the sharp pain in his side a fiery reminder of how close he had come to death. He listened. The shooting from the ranch yard had sputtered and died. The man in the wire was screaming for help now, his panic absolute. He peered over the edge. The outlaw who had fallen lay still, his neck bent at an unnatural angle. One down, one unconscious. He had neutralized the most dangerous sniper post without firing a single shot that could be traced to him. He retrieved the outlaw's rifles and canteens, then shoved the unconscious man's body over the edge to join his partner. He wasn't just fighting them. He was erasing them. He was turning their own tactics of terror back on them. Ludlow would find the position empty, with no sign of a struggle, no bodies, no clue as to what had happened. Just two men vanished into the night. He took a deep breath, the pain in his side a steady throb. He did not go back to the house. The fight was not over. It had just begun. He looked across the dark valley toward the sandstone rocks to the south, the other sniper position. The battle for the Duckfoot was no longer a siege. It was a hunt. And the prey was starting to fight back. With one of the captured rifles in his hand, Rip Campbell melted back into the shadows, moving south. Chapter 15. The dawn that followed the night of the running battle was unnaturally still. The silence from the outlaws' positions was no longer the tense, watchful quiet of a predator waiting to pounce. It was the sullen, brooding silence of a beast that has been wounded and has withdrawn to lick its wounds and contemplate its rage. From the barn roof, Rip could see no sign of movement on the western ridge or in the southern rocks. Lello had pulled his forces in, consolidating them at his main camp, hidden from view. He had lost 4 men in a single night, 2 of them vanishing into thin air, and now he was forced to reconsider the nature of the rabbits he had trapped in the hole. This lull, Rip knew, was a temporary gift, bought with blood and audacity. It was also a window, and it had come not a moment too soon. The knife cut on his side was a thin, angry red line, inflamed and hot to the touch. The pain was no longer a sharp sting, but a deep, throbbing ache that radiated through his ribs with every breath. He had cleaned it with whiskey, a fiery ritual that had made him clench his teeth until his jaw ached, but infection was a subtle and relentless enemy. "It needs carbolic," Sue said, her face etched with worry as she examined the wound in the gray morning light. "And a clean dressing. That shirt of yours is soaked in dirt and blood. We have nothing proper here." "I'm fine," Rip insisted, his voice tight with the effort of ignoring the pain. "No, you're not," she countered, her gaze unwavering. "You're walking stiff, and you've got a fever starting. Another day, and you won't be able to walk at all, let alone fight. One of us has to go to town." "I'll go," Gary said immediately. "No," Rip cut him off. "Ludlow knows you. He knows Sue. He doesn't know what happened to his men on the ridge, but he knows I'm here. He's expecting me to be pinned down. He's not expecting me to ride into Nutgrass for a bottle of acid and some bandages. I'll go. I'll be in and out before they even know I'm gone." The ride was a long, slow exercise in caution. He didn't take the main road. He rode sandy south for miles, deep into the broken country, following dry creek beds and keeping to the low ground, a ghost moving through a sun-blasted landscape. He felt a constant prickle on the back of his neck, the sensation of being watched, but the empty land offered up no sign of pursuit. It was his fever, he told himself, making him jumpy. When he finally circled back toward Nutgrass, he approached it from the west, dismounting a half-mile out and walking the rest of the way, leaving Sandy hidden in a grove of cottonwoods. The town drowsed in the afternoon heat, deceptively peaceful. A wagon creaked down the main street. 2 dogs slept in the shade of the general store's porch. But Rip saw it now through a different lens. He saw the spaces between buildings as potential ambush sites, the faces of the men he passed as masks that could hide a friend of the Kuznic syndicate. Every shadow seemed deeper, every closed door a secret. His destination was the small clapboard house with the neatly painted sign that read, "Dr. M. Miller, Physician and Surgeon." Doc Miller was an institution in Nutgrass, a man with kind eyes and hands that were said to be as gentle as a woman's. He had set bones and delivered babies in the territory for 20 years. The doctor's office smelled of antiseptic and old paper. Miller, a small, balding man with spectacles perched on his nose, clucked his tongue in disapproval when Rip took off his shirt. "Good heavens, son. What did you get yourself tangled up with? A bobcat?" "Something like that," Rip said noncommittally. "A piece of machinery tore me up." The doctor's hands were, indeed, gentle as he cleaned the wound. He worked with a quiet competence, his touch precise. But Rip, his senses honed by days of constant peril, noticed things he might have otherwise missed. The doctor's hands trembled, a faint but persistent tremor. And he kept glancing toward the window, his movements jerky and nervous. "This will need to be stitched," Miller said, his voice a little too high. "And I'll give you a laudanum tincture for the pain. But you must keep it clean, you understand. A wound like this out here, it can turn bad in a hurry." As the doctor threaded a needle, the bell over the office door jingled. The man who entered was Silas, the gambler. He moved with a liquid grace that was at odds with the dusty, rough-hewn town. He was dressed in a fine black coat and vest, even in the heat, and his hands were clean and pale. He stopped just inside the door, his intelligent eyes taking in the scene, the doctor, the needle, the shirtless man with the raw wound on his side. He didn't seem surprised. "Doctor," Silas said, his voice as smooth and cool as river stones, "I seem to have developed a troublesome tooth. I was hoping you might have a moment." Doc Miller froze, the needle poised over Rip's skin. A bead of sweat trickled down from his balding scalp and ran into his eyebrow. "Silas, I'm with a patient right now. Perhaps you could come back later." Silas smiled, a thin, knowing expression that held no warmth. "Oh, I don't mind waiting. I'm in no great hurry." He sauntered over to a chair against the far wall and sat down, crossing his legs elegantly. He didn't look at Rip again. He simply sat, a silent, menacing presence that filled the small room with a palpable tension. Rip's body went cold, a chill that had nothing to do with his fever. The pieces clicked into place with a horrifying, sickening certainty. The doctor's nervousness. The gambler's sudden appearance. This was no coincidence. The doctor's hands were shaking badly now. He fumbled with the needle, his earlier competence deserting him. He took 2 quick, clumsy stitches, his breath coming in shallow puffs. That will have to do," he stammered, snipping the thread. "Just keep the bandage on it." Silas spoke from his chair, his voice casual, almost conversational. "While I'm here, doctor, I was wondering. My companions and I have been out on a hunting trip. A man can get banged up, you know. Scrape sprains. One of my friends took a bit of a fall. Twisted his shoulder up something fierce. I don't suppose you'd have any spare bandages? Or perhaps some of that good liniment you carry?" It wasn't a question. It was an order, wrapped in the thinnest veil of civility. The wounded man from the fight at the house. Ludlow's man. The syndicate wasn't just being supplied from town. It was being tended to. Patched up. Kept in fighting shape by the town's own doctor. Doc Miller's face was ashen. Yes, of course. I can prepare a package for you, Silas. For your friend." Rip stood up slowly, pulling his torn shirt back on. He laid a silver dollar on the table. The doctor didn't even look at it. Silas watched him, his eyes missing nothing, a faint, mocking amusement in his gaze. He knew that Rip knew. And he didn't care. He was untouchable here. This was his town. Rip walked out of the office, the bell jingling his departure. The afternoon sun seemed harsh and accusatory. He felt the stitches pull in his side, a sharp, physical pain that was nothing compared to the cold dread spreading through his chest. He stood on the dusty street and looked at the town of Nutgrass. He saw the blacksmith at his forge, the storekeeper laughing with a customer on the porch, the women hanging laundry behind their houses. And he wondered, who else? Who else was on the syndicate's payroll? Who else was pretending to be a decent, law-abiding citizen while helping a gang of murderers lay siege to a family miles out of town? The sheriff was afraid of them. The doctor was working for them. The betrayal wasn't just a possibility. It was a fact, woven into the very fabric of the community. He couldn't buy ammunition. He couldn't trust the food. Every friendly face was now a potential enemy. Every helping hand a potential trap. He had ridden into town seeking medicine and supplies. He was leaving with the terrible knowledge that the fortress he had built at the Duckfoot was useless. The real fight wasn't there. The real rot was here. He looked east, back toward the ranch, then west, toward the setting sun. He was standing on an island of betrayal, and he had to get back to his own besieged rock, through a sea of enemies he could no longer see. Chapter 16. It's not just the doctor. Rip Campbell's voice was low, raspy with fever and the dust of his long ride. He sat at the kitchen table, the crude stitches in his side pulling with every breath, a bottle of the doctor's carbolic acid standing untouched before him. The knowledge he carried, was a far more potent poison than any infection. It's the whole town. Or enough of it to matter. They're not just turning a blind eye, Gary. They're helping them. Supplying them. Patching them up when we shoot them. Gary Grayson slammed his fist down on the table, the plates and cutlery jumping with the impact. The whole town. Gus Blevens, Doc Miller, who else? The storekeeper who sold you the coffee? The blacksmith? Where does it end? It ends where their fear ends, Rip said, his eyes hollow. And men like Ludlow and Silas are experts at planting fear. It grows better than corn in this country. We're cut off. The Duckfoot is an island, and the water is rising on all sides. Sue, who had been listening from the shadows, stepped forward into the lantern light. She picked up the bottle of carbolic and a clean strip of linen. Then we'll learn to live on the island, she said, her voice a bedrock of calm in the swirling currents of despair. But first, we have to keep our only fighting men on their feet. Take off your shirt, Rip. The cleaning of the wound was a silent, grim affair. Rip's jaw was a corded knot of muscle, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of the table. But through the haze of pain, his mind worked, chewing on the hard gristle of their new reality. He had seen the men on the porch of the general store, the way they had averted their eyes when he walked past. He had felt the chill in the air that had nothing to do with the weather. It was the deep, permeating chill of communal guilt, of a town that had sold its soul for a quiet life. As Sue tied off the clean bandage, a flicker of movement outside caught Rip's eye. It was far off, on the low ridge that marked the boundary of their neighbor's property to the south, the Henderson place. It wasn't a rider or a man on foot. It was a flash of reflected light, a brief starlight glint that winked once, twice, then vanished. "Did you see that?" he asked, his voice tight. Gary moved to the window. "See what?" "I don't see anything." "A light," Rip said. "Like a mirror. On the Henderson Ridge." The Henderson Ranch had been quiet for months. Jed Henderson had died in a supposed hunting accident back in the spring, and his wife Martha had kept to herself, a widow swallowed by grief and the crushing work of a ranch too big for one person. "Probably just a piece of tin or a broken bottle catching the sun," Gary said, though he kept watching. The light flashed again, this time in a clear, deliberate pattern, 2 short flashes, then a long one. It was a signal. "That's no accident," Rip said, standing up, the movement sending a fresh wave of fire through his side. "Someone is trying to get our attention. Someone who doesn't dare ride down into the valley." An hour later, as dusk began to bleed across the sky, Rip was moving south, keeping to the shadows of the outbuildings. The pain in his side was a constant, grinding companion, but a new, cautious hope warred with the fever. A signal meant an ally, and at that moment, one ally was worth more than a regiment of cavalry. He carried a rifle and a canteen, a ghost slipping through his own siege lines. He reached the dry creek bed that marked the edge of the Duckfoot property, and followed it toward the rendezvous point, a cluster of ancient, wind-scoured junipers that stood on the boundary line. The air grew cooler as he climbed out of the small valley. He moved with a slow, deliberate caution, every sense straining into the twilight. She was already there, a slim, dark figure standing beside one of the gnarled trees, a spyglass in her hand. It was Martha Henderson. Her face, in the fading light, was pale and drawn, aged by more than just the sun and wind. Her eyes were the eyes of someone who had stared into the abyss and had seen it stare back. "Mr. Campbell?" she asked, her voice a little more than a whisper. She held a shotgun in the crook of her arm, and she held it like she knew how to use it. "Ma'am," Rip acknowledged, stopping a respectful distance away. "You were signaling." "I had to," she said, her words tumbling out in a rush, as if a dam had broken inside her. "I've been watching. Through this." She patted the spyglass. "I've seen them. The men on the ridge. I saw you last night. I saw what you did. Her eyes, wide and dark, held a mixture of terror and awe. "And I saw your ride into town today. I know where you went. I know who you saw." Rip's hand instinctively went to the hilt of his pistol. "What do you know, Mrs. Henderson?" Her story came out in ragged, painful pieces, a confession whispered to the wind and the dying light. Her husband, Jed, hadn't died in a hunting accident. He had been murdered. "He was a freighter, Mr. Campbell," she said, her voice cracking. "He had the big wagon. He hauled goods from the railhead. A few months ago, they came to him. The Kuznics. They said they had a contract, a big one, hauling mining equipment. Paid him in cash, more money than we'd ever seen. But the goods, they weren't mining equipment. They were boxes of rifles, crates of ammunition, barrels of whiskey, all coming from a warehouse in town, a warehouse owned by a man everyone respects." She told him how Jed had made 3 trips, hauling supplies out to a hidden camp deep in the Badlands. He was afraid, she said, terrified. But the money was too good, and the threats, unspoken but ever-present, were too real. He had become the syndicate's private supply train. "The last trip," she said, choking back a sob, "he came back different. He'd seen something. Something bad. I think he saw them with the money from the Black Creek robbery. He told me we had to leave. We were going to pack up and be gone by morning. But we never got the chance." She didn't have to finish. Rip could see the rest of the story in the haunted depths of her eyes. Lello and his men couldn't afford a loose end, a freighter who knew their secrets, their supply lines, their hideout. So they had silenced him, staging it to look like an accident. "They think I don't know," Martha whispered, her knuckles white on the shotgun. "They think I'm just a grieving widow. But Jed told me things. He told me where their camp is. It's an old abandoned line shack in a box canyon, 20 miles northeast of here. Hard to find if you don't know where to look. He said they keep a poor watch. They're arrogant. They think no one would ever dare." She reached into her dress pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was a crude map, drawn by her husband's hand. An X marked the location of the line shack. "There are 7 of them left," she said. "Ludlow and the gambler Silas. And 5 more hard cases they brought in from the border. I've counted them with the glass. They get careless at night. They drink. They play cards. They think you're trapped here, waiting to die." Rip took the map. It felt heavier than a slab of lead. It was a key. It was a weapon. It was a death warrant, either for them or for him. He looked at this woman, at the raw courage it had taken for her to make contact, to share this secret that could get her killed. She wasn't just a grieving widow. She was a soldier in this war, same as him. "Why?" he asked, his voice rough. "Why tell me this?" Martha Henderson looked him square in the eye, and for the first time he saw something other than fear. He saw a cold, burning ember of rage. "Because you, Mr. Campbell," she said, her voice dropping to a fierce, low whisper, "are the first man I've seen in this territory who looks like he might be able to burn them all to the ground. And I want to watch them burn." Rip folded the map and tucked it into his shirt pocket. He looked back toward the dark shape of the Duckfoot Ranch, then northeast into the deepening shadows of the Badlands. The path forward was suddenly, terrifyingly clear. The waiting was over. The siege was about to be broken. He gave the widow a single, sharp nod of understanding and gratitude, a promise and a farewell all in one, then turned and began the long, silent journey back through the darkness to prepare for a different kind of fight. Chapter 17. You're not going alone. It was not a question. Gary Grayson's voice, spoken in the dark, crowded confines of the barn, was as flat and final as a gravestone. He stood with the crude, hand-drawn map in one hand, a rifle in the other. The lantern light carved deep shadows into the lines of his face, making him look older, harder. "This isn't a debate, Gary," Rip countered, cinching the saddle on Sandy. The horse stood patiently, its breath misting in the cool night air. "You and Sue need to stay here. You need to keep the lights on. Make them think we're all still huddled inside. If they see this place go dark, they'll know something's wrong. They'll come swarming." "And what if you don't come back?" Gary's voice was low, taut with a frustration that went beyond simple argument. "What if they get you? We're left here, blind and waiting for the axe to fall. No. We started this together. We see it through together. I know this country as well as you do. You'll need another gun." "He's right, Rip," Sue said. She had emerged from the shadows, her face a pale oval in the gloom. She held out a leather pouch that smelled of coffee and dried beef. "2 guns are better than 1. But 1 mind is better than none. If you go together. But you go smart. You use the dark. You use the quiet. You become ghosts." The argument was over. The decision hung in the air, unspoken but absolute. They were no longer a rancher and a windmill salesman. They were a raiding party of 2, about to ride into the heart of the beast. Their preparations were conducted in near total silence, a grim pantomime of purpose. They wrapped the horses' hooves in thick burlap sacks, muffling the sound of iron on stone. They chose their weapons with care: pistols for close work, knives for silence, and rifles for the certainty that silence would eventually be broken. They carried little else: water, a handful of ammunition, and Martha Henderson's map, a fragile promise of vengeance folded in Rip's pocket. They led the horses out not through the main gate, but through a section of fence they had quietly taken down behind the barn, a path that led them directly into the concealing folds of the dark prairie. For a long moment they paused and looked back. The windows of the Duckfoot Ranch glowed with a warm, steady lantern light, a beacon of defiant life in the vast darkness. It was a lie, a stage play for an audience of killers, and Sue was the sole actor left on the stage. Then they turned their faces to the northeast and melted into the night. The ride was a slow, nerve-shredding crawl through a hostile world. The moon was a sliver, offering little light and less comfort. They moved through a landscape of unseen things, their path guided by the stars and the feel of the land beneath the muffled hooves of their horses. Every rustle of sagebrush, every cry of a distant coyote, every dislodged stone that skittered away into the darkness was a potential alarm, a signal of their failure. The pain in Rip's side had dulled to a persistent, hot throb, a constant reminder of the stakes. Beside him, Gary rode with a rigid, focused silence, his body a coiled spring of readiness. It was nearly 3 hours before they saw the landmarks from the map, a trio of stone pillars that looked like misshapen teeth biting at the sky. They were close. They dismounted, leaving the horses ground hitched in a deep ravine, their muzzled noses ensuring they would make no sound. The rest of the journey was on foot. The terrain grew rougher, the ground rising toward the mouth of the box canyon. They moved from shadow to shadow, their boots making no sound on the sandy earth. The air grew still, the wind blocked by the rising canyon walls. And then they heard it. Faint at first, then clearer. The sound of a man's rough laughter, sharp and ugly in the pristine silence. Then another voice, and the tinny, mournful sound of a harmonica playing a clumsy tune. They crept to the edge of the canyon mouth and peered down. It was all there, just as the widow had said. A dilapidated line shack, its roof sagging, was nestled against the far wall. A single, smoky campfire burned before it, casting a flickering and trustworthy light. Around the fire sat 5 men, passing a bottle of whiskey between them. A lone sentry stood 30 yards out, his back to them, staring down the canyon, his rifle held loosely in the crook of his arm. He looked bored, his posture slumped. Arrogant. Rip felt a cold, clean fire ignite in his veins. This was it. The carelessness Martha had spoken of. The absolute belief that they were untouchable. He pointed to himself, then to the left, toward a high ledge that overlooked the sentry. He pointed at Gary, then to the right, to a jumble of fallen rock that offered a clear line of sight to the men around the fire. The plan was simple, unspoken. Rip would take the sentry, silently. Gary would be the backup, ready to open fire on the main group if anything went wrong. They would kill the snake by cutting off its head and tail at once. Gary gave a single, sharp nod. They separated, becoming two distinct shadows moving with a single, deadly purpose. Rip climbed the ledge with the slow, patient movements of a predator. The rock was rough under his hands. Below him, the sentry yawned, stretched, and took a long pull from a flask he produced from his coat. Rip drew his knife, the blade a sliver of captured starlight. He measured the distance. He controlled his breathing. He was about to move when the door of the line shack creaked open. The light from within spilled out, and a figure was shoved roughly into the dirt near the fire. It was a man, a homesteader by his worn clothes, his hands tied behind his back. Before Rip could process this, another figure emerged, a woman, her face streaked with tears, followed by a small, terrified boy no older than 7. Hostages. The mission, so clean and simple a moment before, shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. Silas, the gambler, stepped out of the shack after them, looking as immaculate as he had in the doctor's office. He took the whiskey bottle from one of the men and took a long drink. "See," he said, his smooth voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Your neighbors aren't coming. The law isn't coming. No one is coming for you." He gestured to the woman. "But my employer, Mr. Ludlow, is a patient man. He's willing to wait for what's his. You three are just insurance. To make sure the good people at the Duckfoot don't get any heroic ideas." Ludlow himself appeared in the doorway, his massive frame filling it. He looked at the family huddled by the fire with a look of utter contempt. Rip felt a wave of nausea. This changed everything. They hadn't just been waiting. They had been active. They had ridden to the most isolated homestead in the area and taken a family captive, a human shield to protect them. From his position across the camp, Rip could see Gary's silhouette freeze behind the rocks. Their plan for a silent, lightning raid was dead. To attack now would be to sign the family's death warrant. They were trapped, forced to watch, their rifles suddenly useless. One of the men by the fire laughed and reached out, grabbing the woman's arm. "Maybe we can find a use for the insurance while we're waiting," he sneered. The woman's husband lunged to his feet, despite his bound hands. "Get your filthy hands off her." Silas didn't even look up. He moved with a lazy, fluid grace, the back of his hand striking the homesteader across the face with a crack that echoed off the canyon walls. The man crumpled to the ground. The little boy cried out, a thin, high wail of terror. That sound broke the spell. It was the sound of innocence being crushed under the heel of pure evil. Across the canyon, Rip saw Gary slowly, deliberately raise his rifle to his shoulder. There was no more stealth. There was no more plan. The outlaws had made the choice for them. Rip mirrored the action, the worn stock of his own rifle finding the familiar groove of his shoulder. He centered the front sight on the dark shape of the sentry, who had turned to watch the cruel drama unfolding by the fire. He took a breath, held it, and let the night go silent in his mind, the boy's cry the last thing he heard. His finger tightened on the trigger. Chapter 18. Hold your fire, damn it. The words were a raw, desperate hiss in the darkness, and Rip Campbell's hand shot out, grabbing the barrel of Gary Grayson's rifle, forcing it down. The cold steel of the barrel was a conduit for the violent tremor that shook Gary's entire body. Across the canyon, the child's thin wail had subsided into a series of ragged, terrified sobs. "They're killing him, Rip," Gary breathed, his voice strangled. "Right in front of his wife and boy. We have to. We fire now, and that whole family dies," Rip cut him off, his voice a low, urgent current of command. Silas will kill the woman before our second shot clears the barrel. This isn't a fight anymore. It's a hostage trade. We just don't have anything to trade yet. The logic was brutal and inescapable. They were pinned by their own morality. To act was to condemn the innocent. To do nothing felt like a betrayal of everything they were fighting for. Slowly, painfully, Gary lowered his rifle. The moment for violence had passed, leaving behind the bitter ash of impotence. They pulled back from the canyon rim, retreating into the deeper shadows. The sounds from the camp, the low murmur of the outlaws' voices, the occasional whimper from the child, followed them, clinging like burrs. "So what do we do?" Gary asked, his voice rough with frustration. "We just sit here and listen? We let them?" "No," Rip said. "We change the game. They think they hold all the cards. We have to show them there's a card they didn't know was in the deck." They waited. It was the longest night of Rip's life, a slow, tortuous crawl of hours marked by the shifting of the stars and the steady, throbbing ache in his side. They didn't speak. There was nothing to say. They listened to the sounds of the camp, every laugh, every shouted word, a fresh turn of the screw. They were no longer hunters. They were unwilling guardians, keeping a grim vigil over a family they couldn't save. When the first hint of gray stained the eastern sky, Rip moved. He took the clean bandage Sue had tied around his wound and tore a long strip from it. He found a straight, dry branch of sagebrush and tied the white cloth to the end. "A white flag." Gary's voice was incredulous. "You're going to surrender?" "I'm going to talk," Rip corrected him. "There's a difference." He chose his spot carefully, a high point on the canyon rim that was clearly visible from the outlaws' camp but offered him cover on three sides. As the sun's first rays struck the tops of the canyon walls, painting them a bloody red, Rip stood. He held the makeshift flag high, a stark white slash against the morning sky. He stood there for a full minute, a solitary, defiant figure completely exposed. Then he dropped back behind the rocks. It didn't take long. A shout from the camp, then the sight of Lello and Silas emerging from the line shack, shielding their eyes against the new day. "Hello, the camp." Rip's voice echoed in the still morning air, the sound bouncing off the stone walls. "Let's talk." "Campbell." Ludlow's roar was the sound of a grizzly bear disturbed from its den. "You got a hell of a nerve showing your face." "I've got more than that." Rip shouted back. "I've got what you came for. The $30,000. A tense silence fell over the canyon. Rip could almost feel the weight of their greed, their surprise. He had just changed the board. "You're a liar," Ludlow bellowed, but there was a new note of uncertainty in his voice. "Am I?" Rip called. "Ask yourself this, Ludlow. Why else would I still be here? Why would I fight so hard for another man's ranch? The money's here. It was always here. And I'm ready to make a trade." Silas stepped forward, his cool voice cutting through Ludlow's bluster. "What kind of trade, Mr. Campbell?" "It's simple," Rip yelled. "The family you've got there. You let them go. Unharmed. You let the man, the woman, and the boy walk out of this canyon. Once they're clear, I'll tell you where to find the money." "No deal." Ludlow roared immediately. "You bring the money to us. Then we let the hostages go." "Not a chance," Rip countered. "I give you that money, and you have no reason to keep any of us alive. The family walks first. That's the only way." The two men conferred, their heads close together. Rip knew this was the critical moment. It was a test of wills, played out across 200 yards of open air. He was banking on one thing. Their greed was stronger than their caution. It was Silas who answered. "All right, Campbell. Here's the deal. We'll meet you halfway. You bring the money. We'll bring the family. The exchange happens in the open. You try anything, the family dies. We try anything, you get to keep the cash. That sound fair to you?" "It sounds fair enough," Rip yelled back. "But not here. Neutral ground. The 3 stone pillars. High noon. You come with 2 men. Yourself and Ludlow. No one else. We'll be watching. We see 1 extra rider. The deal is off and the money disappears for good." Another long pause. The pillars were a known landmark, far from the ranch, far from their camp. It was a classic, neutral setting. "Noon?" Silas shouted, his voice carrying a note of finality. "Don't be late, Campbell. The boy gets thirsty in the midday sun." The threat was clear. Rip pulled back from the edge, his shirt soaked with sweat that was cold despite the growing heat. He had bought the family time. Now he had to buy their lives. He and Gary made their way back to the horses, their movements hurried but deliberate. "You can't trust them," Gary said as they rode. "The moment they have the money, they'll kill you." "I know," Rip said, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Back at the Duckfoot, they went straight to the cellar. In the dim, musty light, Rip unearthed the heavy canvas sacks of stolen money. He counted out stack after stack of banknotes, the sheer volume of it obscene. He counted out $15,000. Then he stopped. He stuffed that amount into 1 large sack, making it look full and heavy. The other half, he returned to the hiding place. Gary stared at him. "What are you doing?" "That's only half of it." "Exactly," Rip said, hefting the bag. It was heavy enough to be convincing. "Silas is a gambler. He's playing the odds. He's expecting me to be desperate, to make a mistake. He's not expecting me to be holding a card back." "He'll count it," Gary insisted. "He'll know." "He won't have time," Rip said, his plan taking its final sharp form in his mind. "I'm going to make the trade. I'll give him the bag. By the time he realizes it's light, the family will be safe with you, and I'll be long gone. And they'll still want the other half. It forces their hand. It makes them come to me on my terms for the final play." It was a bluff of breathtaking audacity. He was betting his life, and the lives of the hostages, on his ability to outthink a man like Silas. It required a cold nerve that bordered on madness. "It's too risky," Gary breathed. "Everything we've done since this started has been too risky," Rip said, tying the sack securely. He slung it over his shoulder, the weight of it a tangible burden. "This is the only move we have left that isn't just about shooting. It's about winning." He rode out from the ranch alone, the heavy sack tied behind his saddle. He didn't look back. The sun was climbing toward its zenith. The stone pillars shimmered in the distance, waiting. Every hoofbeat was a tick of the clock, bringing him closer to a meeting where the only currency that mattered was deceit, and the price of a bad hand was absolute. He rode on, his hand resting on the rough canvas of the sack, his mind a quiet, cold battlefield, preparing for the final wager. Chapter 19. "You're a punctual man, Mr. Campbell." Silas's voice was as smooth and unrippled as the surface of a deep well. He sat his horse with an easy, indifferent grace, a man untroubled by the oppressive, shimmering heat that baked the barren flats. "I confess, I find that a respectable quality in a business associate." Rip Campbell said nothing. He sat on Sandy 20 yards away, the heavy sack of money a dead weight behind his saddle. Between them, the 3 stone pillars cast long, sharp shadows that did little to cool the scorching earth. The sun was a hammer, beating down from the center of a bleached white sky. Behind Silas, Ludlow Kuznic shifted his massive frame in the saddle, his face a thundercloud of impatience and raw hate. Between them stood the hostage family. The homesteader's face was a mask of bruised, swollen flesh, but his eyes were fixed on Rip with a desperate, pleading intensity. His wife held their small son, her body a rigid shield, her face a blank canvas of terror. "The arrangement was for 2 men," Rip said, his voice flat and hard. He nodded toward a third rider, a lean, hawk-faced man holding the reins of the family's horse, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. Silas offered a placid smile. "A necessary precaution. You understand. One can't be too careful when dealing with a man who has already cost us so much." He gestured with an elegant, pale hand toward the family. "But we are men of our word. The merchandise is here, as promised. Is the payment?" Rip swung his leg over the saddle and dismounted. He moved to Sandy's flank, and with a grunt of effort untied the heavy canvas sack. He let it fall to the dust with a thick, satisfying thud. The sound seemed to make Lello flinch, as if it were a physical blow. "Halfway," Rip said, giving the sack a small kick. "Just like we agreed." He met the homesteader's eyes and gave a subtle, almost imperceptible nod toward the south, where a low, rocky outcrop broke the monotony of the plains. "Go there. Don't stop." Silas dismounted, his movements fluid. He turned to the hawk-faced man. "Let them go." The man released the reins, and the homesteader immediately pulled his wife and child toward Rip, their steps a stumbling, frantic shuffle through the dust. They moved past the sack of money, their eyes fixed on the promise of safety. At the same time, Silas began to walk toward the sack, his boots making no sound. Lello swung down from his horse, his hand never leaving the vicinity of his gun. The space between the two groups closed. The tension was a physical thing, a pressure in the air that made it hard to breathe. The family drew level with Rip. The woman sobbed, a choked, ragged sound. "Go," Rip whispered to them, never taking his eyes off Silas. "Get to the rocks. Don't look back." As they scrambled past him, Silas reached the money. He bent down, his long fingers closing around the neck of the sack. He looked up at Rip, and the mask of civility fell away. His eyes were as cold and dead as a snake's. "You've been a worthy opponent, Campbell," he said, his voice soft. "More trouble than you're worth, to be honest. It's a shame it has to end here." It was the signal. From the rocks behind Rip, from the high ground to the north, from a cluster of mesquite to the east, from 3 positions Rip hadn't known were occupied, came the sharp, flat cracks of rifle fire. It was a perfectly sprung trap, a converging field of fire designed to cut him down where he stood. But Rip wasn't there. The instant Silas spoke, Rip had thrown himself sideways, not toward cover, but flat onto the ground behind Sandy's terrified, rearing form. Bullets whined through the air where he had been standing, kicking up angry spurts of dust. The horse screamed, a sound of pure terror, as a slug tore a furrow along its flank. The double cross. Rip had known it was coming. A man like Silas would never honor a deal when a bullet was cheaper. But Silas's perfect trap had a flaw. He had assumed he was the only one capable of such duplicity. As the hidden sniper's shots echoed across the flats, 2 more rifles opened up from a completely unexpected direction. Not from the southern rocks where the family was fleeing, but from a higher, better position 100 yards to the east of them. The shots were spaced, calm, and lethally accurate. One of Silas's snipers, perched among a jumble of rocks to the north, jerked upright as if pulled by a string, then pitched forward and disappeared. Another, hidden in the mesquite, let out a sharp cry and the sound of his rifle clattering against stone. Silas's head whipped around, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. His trap had been turned. His hunters were now the hunted. Lello stared, his mouth agape, unable to comprehend this sudden, violent shift in the calculus of the fight. From the high ground, a woman's cry of vengeance, thin and clear, carried on the wind. That was for Jed. Martha Henderson. And beside her, Gary Grayson, working the lever of his rifle with a grim, methodical rhythm. The exchange had been a lie. The meeting place was a killing ground. And Rip had led them into his own, better-laid trap. Chaos erupted. Silas, abandoning the money sack, scrambled for the cover of the stone pillars, firing his pistol wildly. Lello, roaring with a rage that was part betrayal and part pure bloodlust, charged not after Rip, but toward the source of the new attack, firing his heavy Colt as he ran. Rip was on his feet, using a terrified, wounded Sandy as a moving shield, firing at the remaining sniper. The homesteader, seeing his chance, grabbed a rock and charged at the hawk-faced outlaw who was fumbling to get his horse under control. It was a swirling, multifaceted melee under the brutal eye of the sun. The carefully laid plans of both sides had shattered into a desperate run-and-gun battle across the open flats. Alliances meant nothing. Positions were fluid. Survival was measured in seconds. Rip saw Silas reach the cover of the pillars. The gambler wasn't fighting anymore. He was running. He vaulted onto his horse, not even bothering to fire back. But he didn't ride back toward the remnants of his men. He spurred his horse west, deep into the treacherous broken maze of the Badlands, abandoning his partner, the money, everything. He was a snake shedding its skin, sacrificing its tail to save its head. Lello saw it too. He saw his partner desert him, saw his perfect ambush turned into a rout. His roar of fury was absolute. He stopped, turned, and for a moment his eyes locked with Rip's across the bullet-torn ground. All the planning, all the scheming was gone. All that was left was the raw, elemental hatred between two men. Then, with a final bellowing curse, Lello ignored Rip, ignored Gary and Martha, and spurred his own horse in a desperate, thunderous pursuit of the man who had betrayed him. The battle wasn't over. It had just changed shape. It had become a chase. A three-way race into the deadly labyrinth of the Badlands. Rip scrambled onto the back of his wounded, panicking horse. He pointed Sandy's head west, his spurs digging into the animal's sides. The family was safe. The gang was broken. But the two heads of the serpent, Silas and Lello, were escaping. And out there, in the canyons where a man could get lost forever, a final bloody reckoning awaited. Chapter 20. You can't go after them. Not like this. Gary Grayson's voice was a desperate plea, his hand gripping the pommel of Rip's saddle. Your horse is wounded, Rip. You're wounded. For God's sake, man, it's over. Let them go. It's not over, Rip said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. He looked past Gary, his gaze fixed on the shimmering, heat-distorted horizon to the west where the two riders had vanished. It's not over until the snakes are dead. A man like Silas doesn't just run. He finds a new hole to hide in. A man like Lello doesn't stop until he's killed what he's chasing, or been killed himself. If we let them go now, this poison will just seep back into the territory some other day, some other way. He gently pried Gary's fingers from his saddle. He looked at Martha Henderson, who stood beside Gary, her face a mask of grim satisfaction, the rifle still held in her hands. He looked at the homesteader family, now safe behind them. He had won the battle. But the war had followed its generals into the wilderness. This part is mine alone, he said. He gave Sandy a gentle nudge with his knees, and the wounded horse, favoring its left side, moved forward into a slow, determined walk. The Badlands swallowed him whole. The open plains gave way to a fractured, broken world of rock and shadow, a place where the sun was a malevolent god and the earth itself was an enemy. The ground became a treacherous maze of narrow canyons, knife-edged ridges, and towering spires of red rock that clawed at the sky like the fingers of a buried giant. This was a land that tolerated no mistakes. One wrong step could send a horse and rider plunging 100 feet onto jagged stone. A hidden turn could lead into a box canyon with no escape. Rip moved with a slow, water-saving economy of motion. The initial, frantic pace of the chase had given way to the grim realities of tracking. Sandy's wound, a long, seeping furrow along his flank, meant the horse could not be pushed. Rip's own side was a constant, grinding fire, the stitches pulling with every jolt of the saddle. He was a wounded hunter, on a wounded mount, pursuing two desperate men into a landscape designed to kill. He found the first sign of their passage an hour into the canyons. A single fresh hoofprint, cut deep into a patch of sandy soil, the edges still sharp. It was from a shod horse moving at a dead run. Silas. The gambler was fleeing, using his horse's speed to put distance between himself and Ludlow's mindless rage. A quarter-mile later, he found Ludlow's trail. It was not a single track, but a brutal scar on the land. Dislodged rocks, trampled sage, the marks of a horse being spurred recklessly, its iron-shod hooves striking sparks from the flinty ground. Ludlow was not thinking. He was a force of pure destructive fury, crashing through the delicate, dangerous landscape in his pursuit of the man who had betrayed him. Rip smiled, a grim, humorless twisting of his lips. This was good. Ludlow's rage made him careless. He was not just chasing Silas, he was clearing a path, leaving a trail a blind man could follow. Rip could hang back, letting the bull chase the snake, saving his own strength and that of his horse. The heat intensified. The canyon walls threw the sun's glare back on him, creating a furnace effect. The air was still and tasted of dust and baked rock. Sweat traced clean lines through the grime on his face. He rationed his water, taking only small sips, swishing it around his mouth before swallowing. The world shrunk to the space between his horse's ears. It was a primal, focused state of existence. Find the trail, watch the sky, listen to the silence. He found the second sign of the chase in a narrow defile where the walls pressed in close. A dead horse. It was Silas's fine-looking bay, its leg bent at a sickening angle, its eyes already swarming with black flies. The gambler had pushed his mount too hard, too fast, and the treacherous footing had claimed it. There were tracks leading away from the carcass, a man on foot moving west. Silas was now dismounted, his speed gone, his vulnerability multiplied 100-fold. Rip dismounted himself, examining the tracks. Silas's boots were expensive, with narrow soles and high heels, the boots of a town man, not a man of the country. They were already scuffed, the leather scraped raw by the unforgiving rock. He was on foot, but he was clever. The trail led into a confusing jumble of ravines and washes, a place where a man could lay a dozen false trails. Rip continued on, leading a limping Sandy. The dynamic had shifted again. Ludlow was no longer chasing a rider, he was chasing a man on foot. The hunt would become slower, more intimate, more deadly. The sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in hues of orange and violet. The shadows in the canyons deepened, becoming pools of impenetrable black. It was in one of these shadows that Rip found Ludlow's horse. It was ground-hitched, its flanks heaving, lathered in sweat. Ludlow had abandoned his mount to continue the hunt on foot, to follow Silas into the tight, twisting places where a horse could not go. The silence of the Badlands was now absolute. The three of them, Silas, Ludlow, and Rip, were all on foot, three ghosts moving through a labyrinth of stone. The advantage had shifted away from brute force and toward cunning, stealth, and knowledge of the land. Rip found a small, hidden alcove, a natural indentation in the rock wall, to make his camp. He gave Sandy the last of his water and chewed on a piece of dry jerky, the tough meat tasteless in his mouth. The pain in his side had become a living thing, a fire that lapped at his strength. He knew he could not last another day like this. The hunt had to end tomorrow. He climbed to a high point above his small camp, a vantage that gave him a commanding view of the surrounding canyons as they filled with the ink of night. He lay on the cold stone, the captured rifle beside him, and watched. He was no longer just the hunter. In this maze, there was no clear line between predator and prey. For hours, he saw nothing but the slow, majestic procession of the stars. He was beginning to think his quarry had gone to ground for the night when he saw it. A tiny flicker of movement on the far side of the canyon, a shadow detaching itself from a larger shadow. It was a man, climbing, moving with a desperate, scrabbling urgency. Silas. The gambler was making for a high pass, the only way out of this section of the canyon system to the west. He was exhausted, his fluid grace gone, replaced by the clumsy movements of a man at the end of his rope. Rip raised the rifle, settling the stock against his cheek. The range was long, nearly 400 yards. It was a difficult shot, even for a marksman, and the moonlight was treacherous. He held his breath, the front sight wavering on the distant, struggling figure. He was about to squeeze the trigger when a new shape appeared, rising up from the canyon floor directly below Silas. It was Lello. He rose like some primeval beast from the earth, his massive frame silhouetted against the pale rock. He had circled ahead. He had trapped the gambler. Lello raised his pistol. Rip saw the muzzle flash, a tiny orange spark in the vast darkness. The sound of the shot arrived a second later, a flat, hard crack that echoed and died. Silas's climbing figure jerked, cried out, a thin, reedy sound that barely carried across the distance, and then he fell, tumbling down the rock face to land in a crumpled heap at Lello's feet. It was over. The snake was dead. Lello stood over the body for a long moment. Then he looked up. He looked directly across the canyon, as if he could feel Rip's eyes on him. He raised his pistol and fired once into the air, a roar of triumph, a challenge, a declaration that only one enemy remained. Then he turned and began to climb the rock face, moving not west toward escape but east, directly toward the ridge where Rip lay watching. Rip lowered the rifle, his heart a cold, heavy drum in his chest. The hunt had ended, and the final battle was about to begin. He scrambled back from the ledge, his mind racing. Lello knew. Somehow, in the dark, in the chaos, he knew exactly where he was. As Rip turned to make his way back down to his horse, his foot came down on a patch of loose shale near the edge of the cliff. The ground shifted under him with a sickening, grinding sound. His balance was gone. He pinwheeled his arms, fighting for purchase on the crumbling rock, but there was nothing to hold. The world tilted, and he was falling. Chapter 21. There was no sound to the fall, only a sickening, stomach-lurching sensation of the world dropping away from beneath him. The night sky, a canvas of cold, distant stars, cartwheeled in Rip Campbell's vision. He flailed, his hands clawing at empty air, his rifle spinning away from him into the blackness with a clatter that seemed miles away. Then came the impact. It was not the long, final plunge he had expected, but a brutal, body-slamming collision with solid rock. The blow drove the air from his lungs in a silent, explosive gasp. Pain, white-hot and absolute, erupted in his side where the knife wound was torn open anew, and a fresh agony flared in his left shoulder as it took the brunt of the fall. He rolled, a loose-jointed collection of protesting limbs, and came to rest wedged against a low boulder, the world a dizzying, out-of-focus smear. He had fallen perhaps 15 feet, landing on a wide, barren ledge halfway down the canyon wall. It was a natural terrace, 100 feet long and no more than 30 feet wide, a desolate stone stage suspended in the immense silence of the Badlands. His prison. His arena. Above him, on the rim of the canyon, a shape appeared, silhouetted against the stars. The massive, bear-like form of Lello Kuznic. He stood for a long moment, looking down, savoring the sight of his trapped and broken quarry. There was no hurry in him now, no mindless rage. That had been burned out of him by Silas's betrayal. What was left was something colder, more patient, and infinitely more terrifying. Nowhere left to run, windmill man. Lello's voice drifted down, calm and conversational, yet it carried an undertone of monstrous satisfaction. I'll give you this, Campbell. You've been a splinter under my nail since the moment you rode up to that ranch. You cost me my brothers. You cost me my partners. But you're going to pay for it all right here. Right now. Rip pushed himself into a sitting position, his every muscle screaming in protest. The world swam, He could feel warm blood soaking the new bandage on his side. His left arm was a numb, useless weight hanging at his shoulder. His rifle was gone, lost to the darkness below. All he had left was the Colt in his holster. Lello began to make his way down, not with a reckless climb, but with a slow, deliberate ease, finding handholds and footholds as if he had been born to this rock. He was no longer just a brute. He was a hunter who had cornered his prey and was enjoying the final moments before the kill. Rip's mind raced, cutting through the fog of pain. He couldn't outrun him. In his current state, he couldn't outfight him in a direct confrontation. Lello was bigger, stronger, and relatively uninjured. He looked around his stone prison, his eyes scanning every rock, every crack, every shadow. The ledge was barren, offering little cover save for a few scattered boulders, none of them large enough to offer real protection. The back of the ledge was a sheer rock wall. The front was a sheer drop into the canyon's black heart. "You see, the mistake men like you always make," Lello continued, his voice closer now as he navigated the last few feet, "is that you think there's a right and a wrong to things. You think there's a law. But out here, there's only what a man can take and what he can hold. I take. I hold. That's my law." He dropped the last few feet onto the ledge, landing with a soft thud that seemed to shake the very stone. He stood 20 yards away, a giant in the moonlight, his pistol held loosely at his side. "My brother Abel. He was weak," Lello said, taking a slow step forward. "Silas, he was a snake. He thought he was smarter than everyone. Look where it got them." He took another step. "But me. I understand the world. The strong eat. The weak get eaten. And you, Campbell, you're looking mighty weak right now." Rip didn't answer. He dragged himself backward, using his good arm, putting his back against the solid rock wall. He needed an anchor. He needed a leverage point. His mind, the mind of a mechanic, was breaking down the problem into its components. The weight of his opponent. The angle of the ground. The stability of the materials at hand. Lello laughed, a low, ugly sound. "Nothing to say. No final prayers. No pleas for the life you're about to lose." He raised his pistol, taking his time, enjoying the absolute power of the moment. Rip's gaze darted past Lello, to the rock behind him. It was a section of the cliff face, weathered and fractured. A series of deep cracks ran through it, and near the bottom, a large, precariously balanced slab of stone, the size of a wagon wheel, jutted out from the wall. It looked solid, but Rip had spent a lifetime observing the effects of stress and vibration on structures. He saw the subtle, almost invisible fault lines around the slab's base. "My only prayer," Rip said, his voice a hoarse croak, his eyes locked on Lello's, drawing his attention, "is that you get to hell before the gates close for the night." He drew his Colt. It was not the desperate, quick draw of a gunfighter. It was a deliberate, calculated motion. Lello, startled by the sudden defiance, fired instinctively. His shot was a fraction of a second too fast, his aim thrown off by his surprise. The bullet shrieked off the rock wall a foot from Rip's head, showering him with stone dust. Rip didn't fire at Lello. He fired at the rock wall 6 inches above the precariously balanced slab. The pistol slug struck the ancient brittle stone with tremendous force. It didn't just chip it, it shattered it. The impact sent a powerful, resonating shockwave, a hammer blow of pure physics, down through the fractured rock. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, with a deep, grinding groan that seemed to come from the bowels of the earth, the massive slab of stone shifted. It tilted, hung for a terrifying second, and then broke free from the cliff face. Lello spun around, his eyes wide with disbelief, as a ton of rock, held in place for 1,000 years, began to topple directly toward him. He had time for a single, bellowed curse of astonishment. He tried to leap aside, but there was nowhere to go. The ledge was too narrow. The slab struck him not with a clean blow, but a grinding, crushing impact that drove him to his knees. His pistol flew from his grasp, skittering across the stone. The rock did not stop. It continued its slow, inexorable fall, pinning his legs, scraping him along the surface of the ledge, pushing him, still alive, still roaring in a mixture of agony and impotent fury, toward the edge. He clawed at the stone, his massive hands trying to find a purchase, but the weight was too much. The rock, and the man pinned beneath it, slid over the precipice. Ludlow's final scream was a long, ragged sound that tore through the night, dwindling as he fell into the black, silent depths of the canyon. Then silence. A profound, ringing silence that was deeper than anything that had come before. Rip lay against the wall, the smoking Colt still in his hand, his body a symphony of pain. He was alive. He was alone. The war was over. He looked at his left arm, hanging limp and useless at his side. He felt the hot, sticky dampness spreading from the wound in his torso. The stars above him seemed to mock him with their cold, serene beauty. The fight was won. But survival was a different battle altogether, and it was just beginning. With his one good arm, Rip Campbell began the slow, agonizing process of trying to push himself to his feet. Chapter 22. He's not coming back. The words, spoken by Martha Henderson into the vast pre-dawn silence, were not a surrender to despair. They were a statement of fact, as cold and hard as the stone beneath her feet. She stood on the high ground overlooking the flats, her spyglass trained on the distant broken labyrinth of the Badlands. It's been too long. A man wins a fight like that, he rides out. He doesn't just disappear. Then we go in after him, Gary Grayson said. He had been reloading his rifle, the quiet mechanical clicks the only sound for the past hour. We don't leave him out there. Go where, Gary? Martha's voice was gentle, but laced with the hard-won pragmatism of a survivor. That's 100 square miles of hell. A place where a man can die of thirst 10 feet from a hidden spring. We'd be searching for a ghost. We could wander in there for a week and never cross his trail. So we just stand here. Gary's voice cracked with a sudden, raw frustration. After everything he's done for us, we just let the coyotes pick his bones. No. He slammed a cartridge home. I'm not leaving him. We won't have to. Martha lowered the spyglass, a new intensity in her eyes. She pointed not into the Badlands, but toward the wide open plains to the south. Look there. A horse. It was Sandy. The big claybank gelding was moving slowly, his gait a painful, limping shuffle. He was riderless, his reins dragging in the dust, his flank crusted with dried blood. But he was walking with a purpose, his head up, making his way steadily back toward the only home he knew. Back toward the Duckfoot. They found Rip 2 hours later. He had not made it off the ledge. He had crawled, inch by agonizing inch, to the spot where Ludlow had begun his descent, and with his one good arm, had hauled himself back up to the canyon rim. That was as far as his strength had taken him. He lay half-conscious near the top of the trail, his face the color of ash, his breathing shallow. His left arm was clearly broken, the shoulder grotesquely swollen, and the makeshift bandage on his side was a soaked crimson ruin. He was alive, but only just. The journey back was a slow, walking funeral procession. They put him on Gary's horse, with Martha walking beside him, holding him in the saddle to keep him from falling. Gary led the way, his face a grim, unreadable mask, holding the reins of the wounded, riderless Sandy. They moved through a silent world, the sheer brutal cost of their victory laid bare with every painful step. For 3 days Rip drifted in a fever dream, a twilight world of pain and disjointed memories. He was vaguely aware of Sue Grayson's cool hands, of her forcing broth and bitter-tasting willow bark tea between his lips. He heard voices, hushed and worried, but they were sounds from a distant shore. He was a machine that had been pushed past its breaking point, and now its gears had seized. On the 4th day, the fever broke. He woke to the familiar smell of coffee, and the sight of the rough-hewn beams of the ranch house ceiling. Gary was sitting in a chair by the bed, his rifle across his lap. "Welcome back," Gary said, his voice quiet. Rip tried to sit up, and a constellation of fire exploded in his shoulder and side. He fell back with a groan. "Lello." "Gone," Gary said. "All of them. We found Silas's body. The Badlands will keep the rest." "The money," Rip began. "It's safe," Gary said. "The other half. Just where you left it. $15,000. That was the question that now hung over the wounded, quiet ranch. $15,000. Enough for them to disappear. Enough to start over somewhere new, somewhere the name Kuznic had never been whispered. Or enough to buy more trouble than any of them could imagine. "We can't keep it," Sue said that evening. They were gathered around the kitchen table, Rip propped up with pillows, his arm in a sling she had fashioned. "It's cursed money. It's brought nothing but death. And we can't turn it in," Gary countered, the old frustration returning. "Not in Nutgrass. Give it to Blevens, and it'll end up in the syndicate's pockets before the sun sets. Doc Miller will have a new carriage, and we'll have a new target on our backs." They were trapped by their victory. They had won the battle, only to find themselves in a strategic checkmate. To keep the money was to live in fear. To surrender it was to empower the very corruption they had fought. Rip listened, his head clear for the first time in days. He looked at these people, at Gary's fierce, protective anger, at Sue's unbreakable, quiet strength. He had come here to sell a windmill, a simple transaction of commerce. Instead, he had become part of their lives, part of their land. Their fight was his fight. "There's a third option," he said, his voice still weak but steady. The others turned to look at him. "We don't give the money to the law. We use it to make the law." He laid out the plan, piece by painful piece. It was not a plan of violence, but of exposure. It was a bluff, bigger and more dangerous than the one he had pulled on Silas, because this time they weren't betting with money. They were betting with the future of the entire territory. 2 days later, a buckboard wagon pulled up in front of the sheriff's office in Nutgrass. Rip was sitting on the seat, pale and gaunt, his arm in a sling. Beside him sat Gary Grayson, his face set and determined. In the back of the wagon, in plain sight of the entire town, was a single, heavy canvas sack. Sheriff Blevens came out onto the porch, his hand instinctively going to his gun. His eyes widened when he saw the sack. "Grayson? Campbell? What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice a mixture of fear and bluster. "We've come to make a formal statement, Sheriff," Rip said, his voice loud enough for the men on the porch of the general store to hear. "And to turn over evidence in the matter of the Black Creek Bank robbery." A crowd began to gather. The storekeeper stopped sweeping. The blacksmith came out from his forge, wiping his hands on his apron. Faces appeared in windows. This was a public reckoning. "This is highly irregular," Blevens stammered, his eyes darting from the sack to the growing number of witnesses. "The situation is irregular," Gary said, his voice booming across the street. "The men who besieged my ranch, who tortured my wife and me, who murdered Jed Henderson, were the Kuznic Gang. They're all dead now. And this," he pointed to the sack, "is part of the money they killed for. $15,000. We're turning it over to you, Sheriff, as the official representative of the law in this county." He let the words hang in the air. He was handing Blevens a stick of dynamite with a lit fuse. Rip spoke again, his voice clear and sharp. "My partner here is riding out for the capital at dawn. He has a full report to deliver to the territorial marshal. It details everything: the siege, the murders, the names of the dead. It also details the assistance the gang received from certain respected citizens in this town. A doctor, for instance. and it will detail the official disposition of this money. The whole territory will be reading about Nutgrass in the Clarion next week. They'll be very interested to hear what the law here does when confronted with a bag full of truth. He had laid the trap. He had put Blevens squarely in the center of it, with the entire town as witnesses. The sheriff's face went from pale to florid, then back to pale again. He looked at the money. He looked at the unblinking eyes of the men on the street. He looked at the hard, unforgiving faces of Rip and Gary. He was a man standing on a precipice, and the ground was crumbling beneath him. His life of quiet, fearful compromise was over. He stood there for a long, silent moment, the focal point of every eye in town. Then he seemed to grow taller. A decision settled in his face, chasing away the fear and replacing it with a grim, weary resolve. He looked not at Rip or Gary, but across the street, his gaze locking on the neat white clapboard house with the sign that read Physician and Surgeon. Without a word, he squared his shoulders, drew a deep breath, and began to walk. He stepped off the boardwalk, his boots kicking up dust in the silent street, his hand resting not on his gun, but on the badge pinned to his sweat-stained vest. He was no longer running. He was finally moving toward the trouble. Chapter 23. Well, I'll be damned. Gary Grayson's voice was a low murmur of disbelief, his words swallowed by the thick, expectant silence that had fallen over the main street of Nutgrass. He's actually doing it. From their vantage point on the buckboard wagon, they watched the small, solitary drama unfold. Sheriff Gus Blevens, his back ramrod straight for the first time since they'd met him, did not stop until he reached the porch of Doc Miller's office. He did not knock. He simply opened the door and went inside. Through the window, they saw the doctor look up from his desk, his face a mask of confusion that quickly curdled into pure, naked fear. The town held its breath. The blacksmith stood frozen by his anvil, a hammer held forgotten in his hand. The storekeeper had not moved from his porch. Faces peered from every window. For years, the town had lived under the shadow of a secret they had all chosen not to see. Now, the secret was being dragged into the harsh, unforgiving light of day. 2 minutes later, the sheriff emerged. He was not alone. He had Doc Miller by the arm, his grip firm, inexorable. The doctor stumbled along beside him, his spectacles askew, his face the color of spoiled milk. He was pleading, his words a high, desperate whine that didn't carry across the street. Blevens ignored him, marching him directly toward the town's small, stone-walled jailhouse. He unlocked the door, shoved the doctor inside, and slammed the heavy iron-barred door shut. The sound echoed down the street like a gunshot, signaling the end of an era of quiet complicity. A collective sigh seemed to pass through the crowd of onlookers. It was the sound of a fever breaking, of a pressure being released. Men began to talk in low, urgent tones, gathering in small groups, their eyes no longer averted but filled with a mixture of shock and a dawning, fearful respect. They had a lawman again. Rip Campbell watched it all, a deep, bone-weary exhaustion settling over him. He felt the tension he had been carrying for weeks begin to uncoil from his spine. The fight, the real fight, had not been won with guns in a canyon, but here, in the open, with the weight of truth and the courage of one flawed, frightened man. "It's over," Sue said softly from behind them. She had come to stand with Martha Henderson, the two women watching the proceedings with a quiet, solemn gravity. "It's finally over." That evening, the Duckfoot Ranch felt different. The barricades were still up, the rifles still loaded and ready, but the suffocating sense of siege had lifted. A breeze blew through the open windows, carrying the scent of sage and clean dust, clearing out the lingering ghosts of fear and gunsmoke. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the silence felt like peace. They sat around the kitchen table, the half-empty sack of recovered money sitting in the corner like a sleeping dog. The rest of it was now locked in the sheriff's safe, a tangible symbol of the town's forced reckoning. Blevens sent a wire to the marshal, Gary reported, pouring coffee. And he deputized 2 men he trusts. They're questioning the blacksmith. Seems he was doing some specialized gun repairs. No questions asked. The rot runs deep, Rip observed, staring into his cup. The fever had left him, but a profound weariness remained, etched into the lines around his eyes. His shoulder ached with a dull, persistent fire. "But you cut it out," Sue said, her gaze resting on him. "You brought the sickness to the surface, Rip. You gave this place a chance to heal." He felt a strange, unfamiliar warmth at her words, but he shook his head. "I just sold windmills," he said, the old phrase feeling hollow now, a relic from a different life. The rest just happened." He found himself thinking of the road. Of the long, open miles, the new towns, the simple, uncomplicated rhythm of selling and moving on. He thought of Sandy healing in the corral, of the feel of the sun on his back with no threat lurking on the horizon. He had stayed. He had fought. He had won. Now, surely, it was time to leave. The news arrived the next afternoon, riding into the yard on a lathered, sweat-soaked horse. The rider was a young deputy from a county 2 days' ride to the south, his face streaked with dust, his eyes wide with the urgency of his message. He was carrying a telegraph dispatch for Sheriff Blevens, but had ridden out to the Duckfoot first. "It's the syndicate," the young man said, accepting a dipper of water from Sue, his hand shaking. "They're not just a few outlaws. It's bigger than anyone knew. The head of it, the real boss, a man they call the Major. He was Jedediah Kuznic's old commanding officer from the war. When the Black Creek money never showed, and then his men started vanishing, he got nervous. Now he's heard what happened here. That his whole operation has been blown open." The young deputy looked from Rip to Gary, his Adam's apple bobbing. "He's not running. He's coming to clean house. He's got a dozen men with him, they say. Not hired guns this time. His own private army. All former soldiers, loyal only to him. They're riding to Nutgrass, to burn it to the ground, to wipe out every witness, to erase the fact that this syndicate ever existed." The brief, fragile peace of the last day shattered like glass. This was not a remnant of the old threat. This was a new one, bigger, more disciplined, more ruthless. This was not about recovering stolen money. This was about eradication. "When?" Rip asked, his voice quiet. "They were last seen crossing the Red Fork yesterday at sundown," the deputy said. "They'll be here by tomorrow evening. Maybe sooner." After the deputy had ridden on to deliver his warning to the town, a new, heavier silence descended on the ranch. This was not a fight they could win. A dozen professional soldiers against a wounded windmill salesman, a rancher, and a town just beginning to find its courage. Gary looked at Rip. "You've done enough. More than enough. No one would blame you for riding out. Take the other road, head west. You could be 100 miles away by the time they get here." The thought was a siren's call. The open road. Freedom. A life that didn't involve staring down the barrel of a gun. Rip looked at his hands, calloused from tools and ropes, but now also from the grips of pistols. He looked at Sue, her face pale but resolute. He looked at the ranch house, its logs scarred with bullet holes, a testament to the battle they had already won. To leave now would be to render all of it meaningless. It would be to admit that men like the Major always won in the end. He stood up, the movement stiff, painful. He walked out of the house and over to the corral where Sandy stood, the wound on the horse's flank beginning to heal over. He ran a hand along the animal's neck, feeling the strong, steady pulse of life beneath the skin. He could saddle him. He could be gone in 10 minutes. He stood there for a long time, the setting sun casting his long shadow across the yard. He was a man, balanced on a knife's edge, between the life he had known and the one that had been forced upon him. The windmill salesman and the gunfighter. Finally, he turned. He did not walk toward the tack room to get his saddle. He walked back toward the house, his steps slow but measured. He picked up the rifle he had left leaning against the wall. He took out his cleaning kit, and with deliberate, methodical motions, he began to oil the rifle's action. The familiar, metallic clicks, a quiet rhythm in the fading light. He was not preparing to run. He was preparing to receive company. Chapter 24. You hardly touch your food. Sue Grayson's voice was soft, pulling Rip Campbell from a place 1,000 miles away. He looked down at the plate of beef and beans she had set before him, steam still rising from it. He had been staring at the far wall, his coffee growing cold in his hand, his mind lost in the silent, empty spaces of the prairie. "Sorry, Sue," he said, picking up his fork. The metal felt unfamiliar in his hand, clumsy. "Guess I'm not as hungry as I thought." "You've been gone for 2 days, Rip," Gary said from across the table. He was cleaning a rifle, his movements economical and practiced. "Not gone from the ranch. Gone from here." He tapped his own temple. "You look at that horizon like you're expecting to see the devil himself ride over it." "I am," Rip said simply. He took a bite of food. It was tasteless, turning to ash in his mouth. "The devil's got a name. They call him the Major." "We'll be ready for him," Gary said, his voice layered with a hard-won confidence. "Thanks to you. This ranch isn't just a home anymore. It's a fortress. You taught us how to make it one." He paused, looking at Rip, his expression earnest. "What you did, saving us, saving that family, waking up the whole town, that's the stuff they write songs about. You're a hero." The word landed on Rip like a physical weight, heavy and suffocating. Hero. He thought of the young outlaw in Devil's Canyon, his eyes wide with surprise as Rip's bullet found him. He thought of the 2 men on the ridge, dispatched in the dark like vermin. He thought of the ugly, final crunch of bone and rock as Lello was dragged into the abyss. There were no songs for those moments. There was only the cold, stark memory of a life ending, and the knowledge that his own hands had been the instrument. He pushed his plate away and stood up, the pain in his shoulder a dull, familiar companion. "I'm going to get some air." He walked outside, into the deep velvet darkness of the Wyoming night. The air was cool and clean, and the sky was a riot of stars, more than a man could ever count. He walked past the barn, his steps leading him, as if by some unconscious instinct, to the windmill. Its blades were turning now, a slow, steady, silent rotation in the gentle night breeze. The sucker rod was rising and falling with a quiet, rhythmic thump clank, the sound of a healthy heart pumping life-giving water into the trough below. The cattle, their thirst finally sated, were dark, sleeping shapes scattered across the nearby pasture. This was what he did. This was who he was. He brought water to dry land. He fixed broken things. He understood the language of gears and levers, of wind pressure and water tables. He could look at a machine and see not just its parts, but its purpose, its potential. The work was honest. It was clean. It left something good and lasting behind. He reached out his right hand, the one that had held the gun, and laid it on the cool steel of the tower's leg. The metal vibrated faintly with the smooth, steady motion of the machine above. He looked at his hand in the starlight. He saw the calluses from wrenches and hammers, but they seemed faded, worn down. Underneath them, he saw something else. He saw the ghost of a pistol's grip, the phantom memory of the recoil shuddering through his arm. He saw the hand that had sent men tumbling into eternity. He had fixed this windmill, but in the process he had broken something inside himself. He thought of his sample cases, still packed and ready in his room. They held miniature gear assemblies, cutaway models of pump cylinders, glossy brochures with drawings of happy ranchers standing beside gleaming windmills. He tried to imagine himself opening them again, sitting in some stranger's kitchen, talking about flow rates and the benefits of a self-oiling gearbox. The thought was absurd. It was like trying to describe the color blue to a blind man. How could he speak of such simple, honest things when his mind was filled with the geometry of a crossfire, the acoustics of a scream in a narrow canyon, the precise weight of a man's life? A hero. The word echoed in his mind, a mocking whisper. Heroes saved people. They didn't lie awake at night seeing the faces of the dead, replaying the moments of violence with a mechanic's cold, dispassionate precision, analyzing his own movements, his aim, his timing, looking for flaws in his technique. He hadn't felt triumph when Lello fell. He had felt quiet. The quiet of a difficult job completed. The quiet of a broken machine finally silenced. He was a different man now. The windmill salesman had ridden into the Duckfoot Ranch, and someone else was going to ride out. Someone quieter. Someone colder. Someone who looked at a ridge not for its beauty, but for its tactical advantage. The easy smile he had used to sell his wares felt like a mask he could no longer wear. The simple pleasure he had taken in his work felt like a memory from another man's life. He had been good at what he did. He had brought water to the thirsty and helped people build their dreams on this hard, unforgiving land. But the price of his heroism, the price of surviving this fight, was the loss of that simple man forever. He had looked into the abyss, and a part of it had taken root inside him. He heard the sound then, faint but growing. A low, steady drumming. It was not the wind. It was not cattle. It was the sound of shod hooves on the hardpan road from town. Many of them. He turned, his body instantly alert, every nerve ending alive. The weariness fell away, replaced by the familiar cold focus he had come to know so well. He saw them crest the low rise a half-mile away, a dark mass of riders moving with a grim purpose. At the head of the column was not a soldier, but the familiar portly shape of Sheriff Gus Blevens. Beside him rode Martha Henderson, a rifle held across her lap. Behind them were a dozen more men, ranchers, storekeepers, a blacksmith, the men of Nutgrass, their faces grim and determined in the moonlight. They were not an army. They were a posse. A community that had finally decided that the boundary of their town was not a line on a map, but a line of courage they had to draw for themselves. They rode into the yard and pulled up, their horses blowing, the air filled with the scent of dust and sweat and the jingle of harness. Sheriff Blevens looked down from his horse. His face was tired, but the fear was gone from his eyes, replaced by something hard and resolute. He looked past Rip, at the lights of the house where Gary and Sue now stood on the porch. Then his gaze settled on Campbell. He didn't address him as a windmill man. He didn't address him as a hero. He addressed him as an equal, a man who understood the bloody work that lay ahead. "The major and his men will cross the Red Fork by dawn," the sheriff said, his voice carrying across the silent yard. "We figured we'd be better off meeting them here, on your ground." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the strange, deadly landscape of wagons and wires Rip had built. "We've come to make our stand with you, if you'll have us." Rip looked at the faces of the townsmen. They were afraid, but they were here. They had chosen their side. He looked at Martha Henderson's unyielding profile, at Gary's steady presence on the porch. This was no longer just his fight. It was theirs, and they were looking to him. He gave a single, slow nod. He turned away from the silent, spinning windmill, the last relic of his old life, and walked to the front of the assembled riders, his limp barely noticeable, his hand resting near the butt of his Colt. Chapter 25. The sun rose on a battlefield that was slowly, painstakingly returning to a ranch. The bodies of the fallen, the major's disciplined soldiers who had discovered too late that they were not fighting ranchers, but an entire enraged territory, had been carried away on a wagon. The last of the posse from Nutgrass was riding out, a column of tired but resolute men, leaving behind the scent of gunsmoke and the profound, ringing silence that follows a great and terrible violence. Sheriff Blevens was the last to leave. He sat his horse beside Rip Campbell, the two of them watching the dawn spill its colors over the wounded land. The sheriff's face was smudged with black powder, his uniform torn, but he sat taller in the saddle than Rip had ever seen him. "The marshal will have a lot of questions," Blevins said, not looking at Rip but at the horizon. "And the Clarion will have a field day. But the syndicate is broken. For now." He finally turned his gaze to Rip. "This territory owes you a debt." Rip shook his head, the movement stiff. His body was a roadmap of pain, but it was a clean pain now, the pain of healing. "You're the one who answered the bell, Sheriff." "You're the one who rang it," Blevins countered. He nodded once, a gesture of profound and spoken understanding between two men who had seen the worst of the night and had lived to see the morning. Then he turned his horse and rode toward town, leaving Rip alone in the quiet yard. Weeks passed. The raw scars on the land began to heal, new grass growing over the churned-up earth. The bullet holes in the barn and the house were patched with fresh-cut pine that smelled sharp and clean in the autumn air. The rhythm of life returned to the Duckfoot, but it was a new rhythm, played in a different key. There was a strength in it now, a resilience forged in fire. The Graysons and the town of Nutgrass had been tested down to their foundations, and they had held. Rip stayed. He told himself it was because his shoulder was still mending, because Sandy needed time for the wound on his flank to fully close. But he knew, in the quiet hours, that he was staying because for the first time in his wandering life, he felt a part of the place he was in. He had bled for this land. He had helped rebuild it. His final job was the one he had come to do in the first place. He was installing the second windmill. He worked with a deliberate, focused grace, his movements sure and economical. He set the foundation, assembled the towering steel lattice piece by piece, until it stood like a second sentinel beside the first. He hoisted the gearbox and the nacelle into place, his good arm doing the work of two, his mind lost in the familiar, comforting language of bolts and bearings, of gears and governors. Gary Grayson worked beside him, a willing and able apprentice. He learned the names of the parts, the feel of a properly seated bolt, the delicate balance of the spinning blades. "You know," Gary said one afternoon, looking up at the nearly completed tower, its blades still and waiting for the wind, "there's more to this life than cattle. A man who could bring water to this territory, a man who knew how to build things that last, he could make a real future here." He didn't look at Rip, but the offer was as clear and solid as the steel tower they were building. "There's room on the Duckfoot for a partner." Rip paused, a wrench in his hand. He looked at the ranch house where Sue was tending a new garden, her movements peaceful and content. He looked at the wide, rolling plains, at the cattle grazing near the first windmill, at the smoke rising from the chimney of the Henderson place, where Martha was no longer just a widow, but a respected and powerful voice in the community. It was a picture of everything a man was supposed to want: a home, friends, a place to belong. A piece of him, a large piece, ached to accept it. But when he closed his eyes, he saw the other things. He saw the flash of a gun in a dark dugout. He saw the cold, calculating eyes of Silas the gambler. He saw the vast, empty loneliness of the Badlands. He had fixed what was broken here, but the knowledge of how easily things could break, how quickly evil could rise, was now a permanent part of him. The open road had once been a way to make a living. Now, it felt like a responsibility. Who else was out there, on some other isolated ranch, about to have their peace shattered? Who else needed a man who knew not just about windmills, but about the darkness that could gather on the horizon? He finished the job the next morning. He climbed the tower one last time, releasing the brake that held the blades. The prairie wind, steady and clean, caught them. They began to turn, slowly at first, then faster, finding their rhythm, spinning with a silent, perfect grace against the vast blue sky. Below, water began to pump, clear and cold, into a new trough. His work here was done. All of it. He packed his things in silence. Into one set of leather cases went his tools and his sample models, the tools of his old trade. He strapped them to one side of Sandy's saddle. On the other side, he tied his bedroll. Then he buckled on his gun belt, the heavy Colt settling into its familiar, worn place on his hip. He was no longer two separate men, the salesman and the gunfighter. He was one man, carrying the tools of both his lives. Gary and Sue stood on the porch to see him off. There were no tears, only a deep, quiet understanding. "The West is a big place, Rip," Sue said, her voice soft. "Don't be a stranger to this part of it." "I won't," he promised. He swung into the saddle. Sandy, fully healed, shifted eagerly beneath him, ready for the trail. Rip looked one last time at the ranch, at the two windmills turning in perfect, silent harmony, at the good people he was leaving behind. He raised a hand in a final salute. Then he turned his horse, not east toward the settled lands, not west into the unknown, but north, toward the territories where the law was thin and the shadows were long. He rode away from the Duckfoot Ranch, a solitary figure moving toward the endless horizon. He didn't know what town he would see next, or what trouble he might find there. But he knew, with a certainty that was as solid as the steel in his hands, that if he found something broken, he would know how to fix it.